The final radio check from a remote mountain pass. Search and rescue logs from the winter of 1988 contain a series of confusing entries regarding a high-altitude pass. These internal documents describe a situation where physical evidence simply vanished into the thin air of the northern wilderness. Gideon Vance was a 54-year-old heavy equipment mechanic who spent his summers repairing remote cellular tower generators. He was a man of few words who preferred the isolation of the high country to the noise of the city. Gideon lived in a small cabin on the edge of the national forest and kept his truck in perfect working order. One frigid morning in November, he received a call to check a failing backup battery system at the Summit Pass. The drive usually took 4 hours through winding dirt roads that were now covered in a thick layer of fresh snow. He packed his heavy tool bag and checked his two-way radio to ensure he could stay in contact with dispatch. Gideon pulled his four-wheel drive truck onto the logging road and noticed the sky was turning a dark shade of charcoal. He reported his departure to the base operator and mentioned that the wind was starting to pick up near the timberline. A loud static burst from his dashboard radio made him reach for the volume knob as he climbed the steep grade. He listened closely, but the sound was not coming from the dispatcher or any other authorized frequency in the mountain range. Gideon pulled over to the side of the road and adjusted the antenna to get a better signal from the valley. He heard a faint, rhythmic tapping that sounded like someone was hitting a metal pipe with a heavy wrench or hammer. The mechanic decided to step outside to see if the noise was coming from his own engine or the nearby trees. The mountain pass was completely silent, except for the sound of his own breathing in the cold and biting mountain air. He looked toward the jagged peaks and noticed that the clouds were swirling in a way that looked almost like smoke. Gideon got back into the warm cab of his truck and realized that his radio was still transmitting a heavy signal. He picked up the microphone and asked if anyone was on the channel, but the only response was the strange tapping. The tapping on the radio changed into a low-frequency hum that made the plastic dashboard of his truck vibrate softly. Gideon checked the battery voltage on his diagnostic equipment, but the readings remained steady despite the strange interference on the air. He knew that his equipment was rated for extreme weather and should not be reacting to a simple mountain winter storm. The hum on the radio stopped abruptly, and a voice began to recite a series of 6-digit geographic coordinates. Gideon grabbed a notepad from the glove box and started writing down the numbers as they were spoken by the voice. He looked at his topographic map and realized the coordinates were pointing to a location exactly 2 miles ahead of him. The mechanic put the truck in gear and slowly drove toward the coordinates while the voice continued to repeat the numbers. He rounded a sharp corner and saw a silver utility van parked in the middle of the narrow and snowy road. The van was covered in a thick layer of frost and appeared to have been sitting in the pass for weeks. Gideon stopped his truck and walked toward the vehicle with a sense of caution that he had developed over many years. He looked through the passenger window and saw that the interior of the van was completely stripped of its original seats. The back of the van was filled with large racks of recording equipment that were glowing with soft green and blue lights. Gideon noticed a heavy black cable running from the van into a deep hole that had been drilled into the rock. He followed the cable to the edge of the cliff and saw that it descended into the dark and foggy canyon. A sudden movement in the driver's seat made him jump back and reach for the heavy flashlight on his work belt. The man in the driver's seat was wearing a thick parka and held a radio microphone in his gloved right hand. Gideon knocked on the glass and asked the man if he needed any help with his vehicle or his radio gear. The man did not move or blink his eyes as he continued to stare straight ahead at the snowy mountain peaks. Gideon opened the door and realized that the figure in the seat was not a person, but a lifelike plastic mannequin. He felt a wave of confusion wash over him as he looked at the intricate wiring connected to the mannequin's head. The recording equipment in the back of the van started to spin, and a high-pitched squeal filled the small space. Gideon reached for the main power switch to stop the noise, but the metal casing was too hot to touch safely. He heard his own voice coming from the speakers in the van describing his departure from the cabin that very morning. The recording was playing back the exact words he had spoken to the dispatcher only 3 hours earlier in the day. He scrambled out of the van and ran back to his truck as the wind began to howl through the pass. Gideon grabbed his radio and tried to call the base station to report the strange vehicle and the automated recording gear. The radio in his truck was dead, and the display screen was cracked as if it had been hit with force. He looked at the silver van and saw that the lights inside were now flashing in a rapid and erratic pattern. Gideon slammed the truck into reverse and backed away from the site until he found a spot wide enough to turn. He drove down the mountain at a dangerous speed and did not stop until he reached the ranger station at the base. The mechanic ran inside and told the duty officer that there was a strange van broadcasting private signals at the summit. The ranger looked at the logs and told Gideon that the road had been closed for 3 days due to ice. The ranger agreed to follow Gideon back up the mountain pass to see the vehicle and the suspicious electronic recording equipment. They drove for an hour through the deepening snow, but they found the road to be completely empty and undisturbed ahead. There were no tire tracks in the fresh powder, and the silver utility van was nowhere to be found near the cliff. Gideon showed the officer the spot where he had parked, but the snow was smooth and white without any marks. They walked to the edge of the cliff, but there was no hole in the rock and no black cable. The ranger told Gideon that the thin air and the cold must have caused him to experience a brief hallucination. Gideon reached into his pocket to find the notepad with the coordinates he had written down during the strange radio event. The paper was in his hand, but the ink had faded into a series of blurry gray smudges that were illegible. He tried to explain that he had heard his own voice on the recording, but the ranger was already walking away. Gideon went home and sat in his quiet cabin while he listened to the silence of the woods outside his window. He turned on his home radio and searched the frequencies until he found the channel he had used that cold morning. There was nothing but the sound of the wind and the faint tapping of a metal pipe against a heavy frame. He realized that the coordinates he had followed were not for a physical location, but for a specific point in time. Gideon never returned to the mountain pass and sold his truck to a local scrapyard a few weeks after that. The cellular company investigated the battery failure at the summit and found that the equipment was in perfect working order. No silver van was ever registered in the county, and no reports of missing mannequins were filed with the state police. The records from that day were filed under miscellaneous interference and were eventually destroyed to make room for new digital files. Gideon Vance lived the rest of his life in the valley and never spoke of the mountain pass to anyone again. Some things that happen in the high country are meant to stay there among the rocks in the freezing winter air. The final radio check from that day remains a mystery that the wilderness has chosen to keep for itself forever. This ordinary motel room raised serious questions. The quiet stretches of highway in the desert often hide locations that seem to exist outside of the normal flow of time. Local police records indicate that room 212 at the roadside inn had the highest turnover rate in the county. Silas Vance was 54 years old and worked as a regional maintenance manager for a chain of budget motels. He had spent 20 years fixing leaky faucets and broken air conditioning units, but he never liked visiting the desert branch. Silas arrived at the property during a heat wave in 1995 with a goal to renovate the back wing. The sun was beating down on the cracked pavement, and the air smelled like dry sage and old engine oil. He unlocked the door to the corner room and felt a sudden drop in temperature that made his skin crawl. The first strange detail was the placement of the furniture, which did not match the standard layout of the company. Silas saw that the heavy oak desk had been bolted to the floor directly in front of the bathroom door. He checked the maintenance logs and found no record of anyone ever requesting the desk to be moved or secured. Silas moved toward the window and noticed that the glass had been replaced with a much thicker grade of acrylic. The manager told Silas that a guest in 1984 had complained about seeing figures standing in the dunes. This guest claimed the figures were not moving, but were simply staring at the window from the edge of the darkness. Silas assumed it was just a prank played by locals or a trick of the light on the sand. An hour later, Silas found a hidden compartment behind the headboard while he was stripping the old wallpaper from the wall. This compartment contained a small handheld recorder and a stack of notebooks filled with rows of very precise numbers. The notes were dated from 1972 to 1988, and they tracked the exact movement of stars. Silas flipped through the pages and realized the handwriting changed every few years, even though the mission remained the same. It looked like a succession of strangers had checked into this specific room to continue a single long-term study. Silas checked the motel guest registry, but the names used for room 212 were all common and fake. It was impossible to tell who had been living in the room or what they were actually looking for. The investigator began to feel a sense of heavy observation as he worked in the dim light of the room. He decided to play the tape from the recorder to see if it contained any clues about the occupants. Silas heard the sound of heavy breathing, followed by a series of rhythmic clicks that sounded like a telegraph machine. A voice finally spoke on the tape, and it sounded like a man who had not slept for many days. The man said that the pattern was repeating and that the window was the only lens that stayed focused. Silas felt a chill despite the desert heat because the voice sounded exactly like his own father who vanished. His father had disappeared during a trip through this valley in 1976 and was never seen again. A third anomaly appeared when Silas pulled up the carpet and found a series of etched lines in the concrete. The lines formed a perfect map of the surrounding mountain peaks and the dry lake beds located to the north. Silas placed his own topographical map over the etchings and saw they matched with a margin of error of 0. One specific spot on the map was marked with a deep red stain that looked like old dried house paint. This spot corresponded to a nearby abandoned weather station that had been shut down by the government in '83. Silas asked the motel manager about the station, but the man claimed that no such building ever existed there. When Silas looked out the thick acrylic window, he could clearly see the white dome of the station glowing. Silas started connecting the dates in the notebooks with the history of the local power grid and the weather station. He used a red pen to circle the nights when the motel experienced total blackouts during the previous 2 decades. The blackouts occurred on the exact same nights that the mysterious guests had recorded the most data in the logs. This pattern suggested that the room was drawing a massive amount of electricity from the main line for something. Silas felt the floor vibrate under his boots, even though there were no large machines running in the motel wing. He realized the room was not just a place for sleep, but was a part of a larger machine. Silas reached out to a retired electrician who had wired the motel back in the late 1960s. The electrician listened to the description of the vibrations, and he told Silas to look under the bathroom floor tiles. Silas broke the ceramic and found a heavy copper cable that ran directly into the earth beneath the desert sand. The old man whispered that the motel was built on top of a natural magnetic fault that distorted radio waves. He claimed that a group of surveyors had used the room as a base to study the bending of time. Silas looked back at the notebooks and realized the numbers were not star coordinates but were timestamps for the future. Every event recorded in the first notebook had eventually come true in the local news over the next decade. Silas found a page that was dated for the current year and saw his own name written in red. The surveyor Elias was the name written at the very bottom of the final notebook found in the wall cavity. According to the notes, Elias had discovered that the room acted as a fixed point in a moving world. Silas realized the man on the tape was not his father, but was a version of the same man. He received one final shock when he looked at the mirror and saw a man in a red jacket. The figure was standing in the corner of the room, but was only visible in the reflection of the glass. Silas turned around quickly, but the corner was empty, and the air was perfectly still and very cold now. He realized that the ordinary motel room was a trap for anyone who noticed the pattern in the logs. Silas packed his tools and decided to leave the motel before the sun went down behind the jagged mountain peaks. He called his office to report that the room was unfit for renovation and should be sealed up with bricks. The manager agreed without asking any questions, as if he had been waiting for someone to finally say it. Silas drove away and watched the motel disappear in his rearview mirror as the first stars began to appear. He kept the final notebook in his glove box as a guide for the years that were yet to come. He never spoke about the motel room to his colleagues or to his family members back in the city. The property was demolished 3 years later, but the concrete foundation remains visible from the high-altitude aerial photos. The mystery of room 212 remains a secret known only to the few who have seen the patterns. Experts say that the desert heat can cause hallucinations that feel as real as the ground under your feet today. Silas knew the difference between a dream and a stack of notebooks filled with the truth of the coming days. He retired to the coast, but he always kept a compass on his nightstand to check for any vibrations. The desert holds its secrets in the sand, and the wind covers the tracks of anyone who wanders too far. The ordinary motel room is gone, but the questions it raised still echo in the silence of the high desert. The local archives still contain some of the blueprints that Silas managed to save from the motel dumpster that evening. These documents show that the building was designed with a specific orientation that aligned with the magnetic poles of the Earth. Engineers who have studied the plans suggest that the room was intended to be an observation post for atmospheric testing. However, the records do not explain why the electricity usage peaked during solar flares, or why the glass was so thick. Silas spent his retirement years translating the final pages of the Red Notebook to understand the fate of his father. He discovered that the surveyor Elias had mentioned a doorway that only opens when the temperature drops in the desert. The names listed in the registry were actually the names of people who had been reported missing in the region. Whenever the moon rises over the valley, the locals avoid the patch of ground where the motel once stood. They claim that the air there feels heavy and that the static on the radio becomes unbearable for any driver. Silas had written a letter to the county sheriff explaining the connection between the room and the weather station dome. The sheriff reportedly burned the letter and told Silas to never return to the county for any reason at all. This reaction only confirmed to Silas that the secrets of room 212 were protected by very powerful people. He kept his silence, but he continued to monitor the news for any mentions of the red jacket sightings. The pattern was still moving, and the room was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. The final entry in the notebook was a set of coordinates that pointed to a location deep within the mountains. Silas never went to investigate those coordinates because he knew that once you step through that door, you never return. He lived the rest of his life with the knowledge that the world is not as solid as it seems. The desert sun eventually bleached the red ink from the pages, but the words were burned into his memory. History is full of these ordinary places that hold extraordinary questions for those brave enough to look under the surface. The motel room was just a room until Silas Vance decided to pull back the carpet and see the truth. The strange events linked to a winter motel. The isolated stretch of highway leading toward the northern peaks remained a silent witness to the brutal winters of the territory. A single automated security camera sat perched atop a weathered steel pole near the remote boundary of a roadside motel. This specific device was programmed to take a high-resolution photograph every 60 seconds to monitor the vacant parking area. Local law enforcement rarely checked the digital archives unless a significant incident or a missing traveler was reported in the area. On a Tuesday in January of 2022, the camera recorded a sequence of images that seemed entirely ordinary. Silas Thorne was a 42-year-old maintenance technician who worked for the Regional Department of Transportation during that year. His primary job involved traveling to remote locations to ensure that solar panels and data transmitters were functioning within parameters. Silas enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the rugged landscape far from the city noise. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific camera unit was experiencing a strange recurring storage error. He packed his tools into his white utility truck and began the long drive toward the isolated mountain pass corridor. The drive took nearly 3 hours, and the fog hung low over the dense canopy of ancient cedar and fir. Silas reached the base of the pole and connected his rugged laptop to the diagnostic port located inside the box. He noticed that the hard drive was almost full of temporary files that should have been deleted automatically every month. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of photographs taken during a recent heavy snow. Silas decided to download the final batch of images before he cleared the memory and reset the internal software. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the thumbnails to ensure the lens was still focused. He saw the familiar gray pavement and the blurred shapes of passing cars that moved through the frame at speeds. One image from 3 nights prior caught his eye because the background lighting looked different from the photos around. A small white sedan was parked on the narrow shoulder of the road just past the edge of the motel. The car had its hazard lights on, and the driver's side door was left standing wide open toward the forest. Silas felt a slight chill because that section of the highway was known for having absolutely no cellular phone service. He clicked on the next photo in the sequence to see if the driver was standing near the vehicle alone. The white sedan was still there, but the open door was now closed, and a dark figure stood near the trunk. The figure appeared to be reaching into the dense brush, and it was pulling something heavy out from the shadows. Silas zoomed in on the grainy pixels until he could see the silhouette of a large and dusty camping trunk. He checked the timestamps and realized that the person had been at that specific location for less than 5 minutes. The third photo showed the white sedan pulling back onto the asphalt and leaving nothing but tire tracks in the mud. Silas looked toward the actual spot on the shoulder and saw that the grass was still flattened near the trees. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished. He stepped over the metal guardrail and walked toward the exact place where the figure had stood in the photograph. The ground was soft from the recent rains, and he noticed deep gouges in the earth where something was dragged. He followed the trail for about 50 feet until he reached a small clearing hidden behind a thicket of ferns. Silas found the camping trunk tucked under a pile of damp pine needles and heavy branches that looked intentionally placed. He reached down to touch the cold plastic surface and saw that the heavy latches were sealed with tape. A faint smell of metallic decay hung in the stagnant air, and Silas immediately pulled his hand back in realization. He used his radio to contact the dispatch office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious item in woods. Within an hour, 2 state troopers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with yellow plastic tape. They asked Silas to show them the photographs on his laptop so they could identify the time and the place. The officers noted that the white sedan did not have a visible rear license plate in any of the frames. They carefully cut the tape on the trunk and discovered several stolen historical artifacts from a local museum storage facility. The museum had reported a quiet break-in 3 months earlier, but the investigators had no leads on the items. These artifacts were extremely valuable, and the thieves had likely hidden them in the forest until the heat died. The police realized the driver must have returned to the woods to move the cache to a more permanent location. They analyzed the road camera data from other units along the highway to track the path of the car. This lead eventually took them to a small rental property located 2 towns over from the edge of the park. Inside the house, the authorities found more items that had been taken during the same heist earlier that same year. The suspects had been living there under false names while they waited for a buyer to finalize a secret sale. One of the men was a former security guard who knew exactly how to avoid the primary surveillance systems. He did not realize that the remote traffic camera was set to trigger every minute regardless of any motion. His simple mistake of parking in that specific spot had provided the only evidence needed to solve the entire case. Silas returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details. Most people would have deleted the corrupted files without looking at the images because it was a routine maintenance job. The winter motel was now clear of the mystery, and the historical treasures were returned to their rightful cases. He continued his work across the mountains and always looked a little closer at the photos from the lonely road. Sometimes the most important things are hidden in the background of a world that is always moving too fast. The automated camera still stands on its steel pole and records the passage of time 1 frame at a time. It captures the fog and the trees and the occasional car that travels through the silence of the deep woods. No one ever suspects that a simple machine could be the most important witness to a crime in the wilderness. Silas knows that every photograph tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to look. He drives the highway with a new perspective and watches the shadows for anything else the lens might catch. Final footage from the camera reportedly showed that the suspects had used the motel as a temporary landmark for their activities. Witness statements gathered later mentioned a white sedan frequenting the area during the hours after midnight when the highway was empty. Dispatch logs confirmed that no service calls had been placed from that vicinity for over 48 hours before the find. The investigation concluded that the thieves had intended to smuggle the artifacts across the northern border by the end of winter. This case remains a prominent example of how routine data maintenance can expose secrets hidden in plain sight for years. The recovered items were documented in archived calls between the museum and the Regional Recovery Task Force as being priceless. Silas often thinks about the moment the progress bar reached 100% and the thumbnail first appeared on his screen. The cold air of the mountain pass still carries the memory of that day when a machine captured the truth. He continues to maintain the network of cameras with a diligence that ensures no detail is ever truly lost. The forest remains quiet now, but the record of the Winter Motel is preserved in the Regional Safety Archives. The story of the stolen artifacts serves as a reminder of the historical significance buried within the small mountain towns. Students now visit the museum to see the displays that were nearly lost to the black market forever. The regional board implemented new protocols to review all storage errors manually to prevent similar incidents from going unnoticed. Silas is often cited in training sessions as the primary example of a technician who performed his duty with excellence. The highway continues to wind through the pines, and the camera continues to click in the silence of the night. Every minute, a new frame is added to the digital history of the Northern Corridor for the safety of all. The record of the world grows steadily as the machines watch over the lonely places where humans rarely venture alone. Silas knows that the truth is always there, waiting to be found by someone with the patience to look closely. The mystery of the Winter Motel is solved, but the watch over the mountain highway will never truly come to an end. The silence of the pines is now filled with the knowledge that the past is finally safe and secure. Why this mountain road is closed every winter. The high-elevation passes of the northern Sierra Range are subject to weather conditions that can bury a heavy semi-truck in minutes. Local highway department records indicate that one specific stretch of blacktop near the granite peaks has remained gated since 1988. Silas Vance was 56 years old and worked as a lead safety inspector for the Regional Department of Transportation Division. He had spent 30 years evaluating road stability, but he always felt a strange pressure in his ears near the summit. Silas arrived at the lower gate during a gray morning in November with a simple goal to check the seasonal locks. The air was thin and carried the scent of frozen stone and the metallic tang of an approaching heavy snowstorm. He drove his four-wheel drive pickup toward the restricted zone and noticed the pavement was covered in thin black ice. The first strange detail was that the road surface appeared to be steaming despite the temperature being well below the freezing point. Silas saw that the heat was coming from the center line and it was melting the ice in a perfect path. He checked the thermal sensors on his dashboard and found that the asphalt was radiating nearly 90 degrees of localized heat. Silas stopped the truck and walked to the edge of the guardrail to see if there were any underground steam pipes. The maintenance logs showed no geothermal activity in this sector, and no utility lines had been buried beneath the remote mountain road. Silas looked down the steep embankment and saw that the snow was completely gone from a circular patch of rocky earth. He assumed it was a chemical reaction from the road salt, but the smell in the air was sweet and floral. An hour later, Silas found a set of heavy equipment tracks that led away from the road and into the trees. These tracks did not match any of the department plows or the standard tread of a modern commercial or civilian vehicle. Silas followed the markings for 50 yards and found a vintage surveyor rod standing upright in the middle of the brush. The metal was polished and looked brand new despite the harsh mountain environment that usually rusted iron in a single season. Silas checked the serial number on the rod and realized it belonged to a crew that vanished in 1972. That specific team had been tasked with mapping the original route before the road was paved for the local logging industry. It was impossible for the tool to be in such perfect condition after sitting in the forest for several decades. The inspector began to feel a sense of heavy static as he held the cold metal rod in his gloved hands. He decided to return to his truck and check the archived radio logs from the year the surveyor crew went missing. Silas heard a recording of a man named Elias who was calling for a location check during a sudden whiteout storm. Elias reported that the road was turning beneath his feet and that the mountain was moving like a massive living thing. Silas felt a chill when he realized the voice on the old tape sounded remarkably clear and lacked any background wind. He looked at the rod again and noticed that it was vibrating with a low frequency that made his teeth ache. The inspector realized the road was not closed because of the snow, but because of a physical displacement of space. A third anomaly appeared when Silas looked through his binoculars and saw a man in a red jacket standing on the peak. The figure was holding a transit level and appeared to be taking measurements of the clouds that were rolling over the ridge. Silas called out to the man, but the wind swallowed his voice and the figure did not turn or acknowledge him. The man moved with a rhythmic and mechanical grace that suggested he was following a very specific set of internal instructions. Silas checked the local missing person files and found a photo of Elias wearing that exact same bright red parka jacket. When Silas looked through the lenses a second time, the peak was empty and only the gray rocks remained in view. He realized the surveyor was still finishing the job he started 50 years ago during the Great Winter Blizzard. Silas started connecting the dates of the road closures with the cycles of the lunar calendar and the mountain solar flares. He used a red pen to mark the years when the department had reported seeing ghost lights on the high summit. The sightings occurred on the exact nights when the road temperature spiked and the ice began to melt from the asphalt. This pattern suggested that the mountain road was acting as a conductor for an energy source that originated deep inside. Silas felt the ground buckle slightly beneath his boots, even though the seismic monitors in the valley remained perfectly still. He realized the asphalt was not just a road, but was a seal placed over a very thin spot in reality. Silas reached out to a retired foreman who had helped pave the mountain pass back in the late 60s. The foreman listened to the description of the steam, and he told Silas to leave the summit before the sun set. The old man whispered that the road was built with a special volcanic aggregate that was supposed to prevent heavy ice. He claimed the stones were taken from a site that the local tribes had warned the engineers to leave alone forever. Silas looked back at the surveyor rod and realized the notches were moving, as if the metal were slowly breathing. Every name listed in the original crew manifest was actually a descendant of the people who once protected the high peaks. Silas found a note in the foreman diary that described a road that leads to a place without time. The surveyor, Elias, was the last person to stand on the summit before the road was officially gated and locked in '88. According to the final report, Elias had discovered that the mountain was not made of solid granite, but of hollow light. Silas realized the man in the red jacket was not a ghost, but was a part of the mountain itself. He received one final shock when he looked at his own GPS and saw his location was listed as sea level. The figure in the red jacket appeared at the edge of the woods and pointed toward the lower valley gate. Silas turned his truck around and drove down the mountain as fast as the black ice would allow him to. He realized that the ordinary mountain road was a bridge that only opened when the cold air hit the peak. Silas packed his gear and decided to report that the road was structurally unsound and should be decommissioned for public use. He called his supervisor to say that the granite was shifting and that the risk of a landslide was high. The supervisor accepted the report without any questions, as if he had been waiting for an excuse to keep it closed. Silas drove away and watched the summit disappear in the fog as the first heavy flakes of the storm fell. He kept the surveyor rod in his truck as a reminder of the man who was still measuring the peaks. He never spoke about the steam or the red jacket to the other inspectors or to the local media. The road remains closed every winter because the mountain needs to finish its work in the silence of the snow. The mystery of the mountain road remains a secret known only to those who have felt the heat of the asphalt. Experts say that the steam is caused by a natural underground spring that warms the rocks during the winter months. Silas knew the difference between a natural spring and a road that was trying to tell him a long story. He lived the rest of his life watching the mountains from the safety of the valley floor and the sun. The forest holds its secrets in the deep snow, and the wind covers the sound of the surveyor at work. The quiet warnings were real, and the road is still waiting for the next storm to open the door. Silas Vance died, knowing that some places on a map are not meant to be traveled by the living. The Department of Transportation eventually reinforced the gates and added a row of heavy concrete barriers to the entrance. They cited geological instability and unpredictable rockfalls as the primary reasons for the permanent closure of the northern pass. Silas often looked at his old field notes and wondered if the surveyor rod was still vibrating in the basement. He had noticed that the serial number on the rod matched the coordinates of the melting circle on the mountain. This suggested that the tools were not just instruments for measuring, but were anchors for a different kind of reality. The red jacket had become a legend among the younger rangers who claimed to see flashes of color in the fog. They spoke of a man who looked through a transit at things that were not yet built in the valley. Historical archives from the county museum revealed that several other roads in the region had been closed for similar reasons. Most of these trails led to ancient quarries where the stones were supposedly restless and warm even in the dead of winter. Silas had suspected that the entire mountain range was connected by a network of energy that the road had accidentally tapped. He spent his final months writing a manuscript that explained the relationship between the blizzard and the magnetic shifting. The pages were filled with diagrams of the surveyor rods and the way they aligned with the stars above. He knew that his work would likely be dismissed as the ramblings of an old man who spent too much time alone. Yet he felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had documented the pattern for the next inspector. Whenever a heavy storm approaches the valley, the residents look up at the dark silhouette of the jagged mountain range. They see the faint glow of the summit, and they know that the road is busy with the work of ghosts. The snow falls in thick blankets that cover the tracks of the man in the red jacket until spring. Silas had left instructions to have his ashes scattered at the base of the ridge near the lower gate. He wanted to be part of the mountain that he had spent so many years trying to understand and map. The road is just a line on a map, but it is also a boundary between the known and the unknown. The gates remain locked, but the measurements continue every single time the temperature drops below the freezing point. The mountain is alive, and it is still waiting for the survey to be finished by the man in red. In this new story, archived incident logs mention a remote ranger station where the final recorded footage surfaced during a massive January blizzard that cut power across several mountain routes. The footage appeared normal at first, yet investigators noted abrupt audio distortions moments before the feed ended. Locals still mention the event when storms roll through that region. Darren Morrow, a 38-year-old seasonal ranger, arrived at the station shortly after noon to prepare for worsening conditions. His assignment involved monitoring trail beacons and checking radio towers before the storm blocked access. He expected a long shift because the blizzard warning described unusually fast-moving cloud bands capable of burying vehicles within minutes. He carried a thermos of coffee, his logbook, and an old camcorder used for final checks before each closure. Snowfall increased as he hiked the short path leading to the outpost. The cabin-sized station stood on a ridge overlooking a frozen valley. Wind pushed against its wooden frame, which creaked with each gust. He unlocked the door, then stepped inside while his boots scattered snow across the floorboards. The air felt colder than usual, which suggested the old furnace struggled to keep up with incoming wind. He wrote a note about adding extra insulation during the next supply run. Darren began recording a standard check-in message for the regional office. The camcorder rested on a small tripod that faced the desk and radio console. As he spoke, he heard faint rattling outside, which might have been ice sliding off the roof. The footage captured him turning toward the window briefly before returning to his report. He mentioned the storm pattern shifting earlier than forecast, which matched updates from nearby stations. After finishing the recording, he stepped outside to secure loose items, since strong gusts sometimes pulled equipment down the slope. He fastened the shutters, tightened the fuel drums, and checked the tower base for cracks caused by freezing moisture. The wind cut at his jacket, which forced him to work quickly. Far below, he noticed faint lights flickering along the tree line. He assumed the lights came from hikers rushing toward shelter despite posted warnings. He tried raising nearby patrol teams on the radio, yet static overwhelmed the signal. He switched frequencies and heard fragmented voices that cut out mid-sentence. He made a note in his log about interference likely caused by atmospheric distortion. Snow began falling sideways, which signaled the blizzard center approaching faster than predicted. He retreated to the station as visibility worsened until the valley vanished behind gray walls of wind. Inside, he sealed the door and activated the exterior floodlights. The beams barely pierced the storm, yet illuminated swirling sheets of snow. The camcorder still rested on the desk, which blinked with a low battery warning. He replaced the battery, then recorded another clip describing the radio disruption and increasing wind speed. Midway through the message, the cabin door rattled sharply as if someone pushed from outside. Darren grabbed his flashlight and approached the door cautiously. He called anyone out there, but the blizzard swallowed his voice. He opened the door slightly, though the wind forced it against him. A shadow shifted near the propane tank, then vanished behind a curtain of drifting snow. He scanned the area for movement, but saw only storm waves rolling across the ridge. He closed the door firmly and logged the incident because shadows near the tank often meant wildlife searching for warmth. Minutes later, the radio crackled with a distorted tone, followed by a faint voice repeating the word northbound. The message sounded strained and clipped, as if the speaker were fighting heavy wind. Darren responded but heard no reply. He adjusted the range and tried again until only static filled the room. The camcorder recorded him staring at the console while the wind shook the building steadily. He stepped away to check the furnace since the temperature dropped several degrees. The old system clattered like metal plates shifting under strain. He opened the access panel and tapped the ductwork lightly, which helped clear condensation. A low vibration traveled through the floorboards, which made him pause. The vibration felt steady and too uniform for random wind. He checked beneath the sink and along the support beams for structural shifts, but found nothing. Outside, the floodlights flickered as if something obstructed them. The storm intensified, which caused the beams to pulse irregularly. He approached the window and saw brief flashes of orange light along the ridge. The lights moved in a slow pattern like markers following a path through the blizzard. He whispered, "No one should be out there," because the route near the ridge closed hours earlier. Darren put on his gear and stepped outside despite the punishing wind. He moved a few feet from the cabin before the storm nearly pushed him sideways. He braced himself against the railing and scanned the ridge for the orange lights, yet they faded instantly. Snow whipped across his face in dense sheets, which forced him to retreat inside. He shook off ice and placed his gloves near the furnace to thaw. The camcorder recorded him pacing between the window and radio console. The audio captured faint thumps from the roof, which sounded heavier than falling ice. He grabbed a long-handled broom and tapped the ceiling in several spots to dislodge buildup. More thumps echoed, which made him lower the broom slowly. He wrote another entry in his log describing rhythmic impacts not caused by tree limbs or loose panels. Storm pressure increased until the station walls groaned steadily. The camcorder captured a brief flicker of the lights, followed by darkness. Emergency lanterns activated automatically, which cast the room in a dim amber glow. The radio emitted a harsh frequency spike, then cut off completely. Darren pulled the backup receiver from a metal case and attempted contact again, yet no channels reached through the storm. A sharp knock hit the door, which startled him enough to step back. He called, "Identify yourself," yet only the wind answered. He approached the peephole and saw nothing except swirling white. When he unlatched the top bolt, a second, harder strike hit the frame. He shut the bolt quickly while breathing heavily. He checked the window, yet the ridge remained invisible within the storm. He reviewed the exterior camera feed connected to a small monitor near the desk. The screen showed distorted snow patterns and brief static bursts. He switched angles until one camera displayed a dark shape hovering near the propane tank. The shape moved out of frame before the feed failed entirely. He reached for his coat again, but decided against stepping outside after remembering the collapsing visibility. The floor vibrated once more as if heavy machinery operated underground. The station had no subterranean structures, which made the sensation more concerning. He steadied himself while writing in the log about the vibration lasting longer than earlier ones. The camcorder captured the moment the station lights flickered again, while a faint metallic hum filled the room. Darren turned toward the window when a sudden flash illuminated the ridge. The flash looked like a flare, yet burned too quickly to match standard emergency equipment. He moved closer until the vibration intensified. Snow along the windowsill shook loose, which signaled a stronger tremor under the cabin. He grabbed the radio microphone and attempted one final call. The transmission failed mid-sentence, which caused the radio to emit a shrill tone. The camcorder picked up the moment he dropped the microphone and reached for the breaker panel. He reset the switches, though the storm overpowered the system instantly. He shut the panel and stepped back when the knock returned to the door with a deep, hollow sound. He called out again, but received no reply. His voice cracked with fear, which rarely happened during his long years at remote posts. He prepared to secure the shutters when the propane tank outside let out a sharp pop caused by sudden pressure change. He rushed to the window, yet could not see through the frozen glass. He scraped frost away and saw faint movement near the tank, but the blizzard distorted everything into shapes he could not identify. The camcorder recorded the room shaking twice before a heavy impact landed against the wall facing the ridge. The lanterns wavered as another vibration traveled through the floor. Darren grabbed the emergency flare gun and aimed it at the door, even though firing inside would be dangerous. He backed toward the desk while keeping his eyes on the entrance. A final burst of wind slammed against the station, which caused the camcorder tripod to wobble. The camera tilted slightly as Darren shouted something partly drowned by the storm. The feed captured one last frame of him turning toward the window when a brilliant light filled the room for a split second. The video ended abruptly as the camera lost power. Rescue teams reached the station 2 days later after the blizzard subsided. They found the structure partially buried and the door forced inward by snow pressure. Darren's gear remained inside, yet he was missing. The propane tank showed signs of rapid freezing, then sudden expansion. Survey crews noted unusual ground disturbances near the ridge, though no modern machinery was found. Authorities recovered the camcorder near the desk, where it had fallen during the final minutes. Forensic review confirmed no tampering and no clear explanation for the final light captured on the feed. Audio analysis detected low-frequency vibrations matching subsoil shifts often recorded near unstable terrain, though the ridge showed no signs of collapse. Locals believe the ridge amplifies storm pressure, which creates strange lights and sounds. Some claim older tunnels exist beneath the station, built during a forgotten project, though no records confirm their purpose. Others think the flashes are atmospheric arcs triggered by intense blizzard conditions. Darren's disappearance remains an unsolved entry in the regional archive. Each January, rangers at nearby posts mention hearing faint vibrations during heavy storms. They sometimes report flickering lights near the ridge, which vanish before verification. The station still stands as a supply shelter, though it remains unstaffed during deep winter. Footage from that final night remains part of training sessions for new rangers. In those recordings, Darren's voice grows strained as each vibration grows stronger. The storm outside presses against the walls like a living presence. The video ends before any clear answer appears, which leaves viewers with the same uncertainty investigators faced. Snow still buries the ridge each winter. Wind still carves deep whirls near the outpost. Travelers who pass through the area during storms sometimes hear faint knocking carried through the cold air. Most dismiss the sound as shifting ice, though a few believe the ridge holds more than wind and snow. They mention Darren's final footage, which captures a moment where something pressed close to the station during a blizzard that erased nearly all visibility except for one last flash that no one has ever explained. This security footage was reviewed years later. The grainy black and white pixels of an old security tape often hide more secrets than they reveal to the naked eye. Digital archives from the mid-1990s show that most regional storage facilities only kept footage for 30 days before recording over it. Silas Vance was 62 years old and worked as a consultant for a private archival firm specializing in cold cases. He had spent his entire career looking for the small details that other investigators missed during the initial chaos of a crime. Silas arrived at the climate-controlled warehouse in the autumn of 2024 to review a box of labeled tapes. His goal for the week was to digitize the final records of a defunct shipping company located in a remote valley. The air inside the vault was dry and smelled of old magnetic tape and the faint scent of ozone from the machines. The first strange clip appeared on a tape labeled 17 January 1988 at precisely 2 o'clock in the morning. It showed the perimeter fence of a loading dock during the height of a historic blizzard that had paralyzed the entire region. Silas watched as a man in a thick jacket walked slowly past the camera while carrying a long metallic surveyor rod. The man did not look at the lens, but he moved with a strange mechanical rhythm that seemed to ignore the wind. Silas paused the frame and tried to sharpen the image, but the snow was too thick to see a face clearly. He logged the timestamp and moved to the next reel, which covered a different camera angle on the opposite side. An hour of footage went by before the man appeared again on a camera located 3 miles away at a substation. This witness footage was captured only 10 minutes after the first sighting, which made the distance traveled physically impossible for anyone. Silas checked the map of the facility and realized the terrain between the two cameras was a steep and icy ravine. It would take a team of professional climbers hours to traverse that gap, even in the best possible summer weather conditions. The figure in the red jacket stood perfectly still in front of the high-voltage transformers for exactly 60 seconds total. He appeared to be taking measurements of the air itself, while the transformers sparked and glowed with a strange blue light. The investigator began to feel a sense of heavy dread as he realized the figure was not a standard trespasser or thief. He decided to cross-reference the footage with the dispatch logs he had discovered in a separate file from that era. Silas found a report from a dispatcher named Vance, who had noted a similar pattern of sightings during that same storm. The logs mentioned a man in a red jacket appearing at various points along the regional power grid in a straight line. Silas felt a chill as he realized the footage he was watching provided the visual evidence for these legendary ghost calls. He reached for a notepad and began to map out the coordinates of every camera that had captured the strange figure. A third clip showed the man standing on the roof of the main warehouse, looking out toward the dark mountain range. The camera was mounted 20 feet high, and there was no ladder or staircase that led to that specific vantage point. The figure held the surveyor rod high above his head as if he were trying to catch a signal from the sky. A massive flash of lightning illuminated the entire frame for a fraction of a second, and the man simply vanished into air. When the light faded, the roof was empty and the only thing moving was the snow blowing across the flat surface. Silas replayed the segment 10 times, but he could not find any evidence of a jump or a hidden door. Silas started comparing the visual data with the original surveyor blueprints for the valley that were drawn in 1972. He used a digital overlay to match the positions of the man with the planned locations for the utility tower foundations. The points on the video matched the blueprints with a margin of error of less than 1 single inch of space. This line did not follow the actual towers that were built, but followed the original path that was later abandoned. Silas felt his hands shake as he realized the figure was following a ghost map of a project that never existed. He realized the man was Elias, who was the surveyor who had disappeared during the Great Blizzard of 1972. He reached out to a contact at the State University who specialized in electromagnetic anomalies and the recording of historical events. The professor listened to the description of the blue sparks and the surveyor rod, and he stayed silent for a long time. The academic finally suggested that the heavy snow and the high voltage lines might have created a natural recording of the past. He explained that certain materials can act as a permanent storage medium for human energy under the right atmospheric pressure conditions. Silas looked back at the screen and saw the man in the red jacket tapping on a window in the background. The tapping was silent on the tape, but Silas could almost hear the rhythmic sound echoing through the empty warehouse vault. The final reel of the collection showed the interior of the dispatch office during the transition of the morning shift change. Silas saw a younger version of himself sitting at the console while staring intensely at a paper map on the desk. In the reflection of the glass window behind the young Silas, he could see the man in the red jacket standing. The figure was not inside the room, but appeared to be standing in the reflection as if he were watching. Silas froze in the frame and realized the surveyor was looking directly at the map and pointing to the final substation. This footage had never been reviewed by anyone because the shipping company had gone bankrupt shortly after the storm of '88. Silas realized the figure was not a ghost in the traditional sense, but was a loop of time caught in wire. He received a final notification from the digitization software that the last tape had been successfully processed and stored in cloud. A technician near the end of the warehouse reported a strange humming sound coming from the old tape player in the corner. She said the machine was unplugged, but the reels were spinning at a high rate of speed while emitting blue light. Silas told her to leave the room immediately, and he locked the door to the vault with a heavy iron key. He looked at the monitors one last time and saw the red jacket standing in the middle of the warehouse aisle. The archival firm finished the project, but they decided to redact the specific timestamps of the man in the red jacket. They found a vintage surveyor rod hidden behind a false wall in the basement during the final sweep of the building. There was no explanation for how it got there or why the metal felt warm to the touch in winter. Silas kept a single screenshot of the reflection in his wallet as a reminder of the man who stayed behind. He never returned to the valley, and he stopped working as a cold case consultant shortly after the project ended. The tapes were destroyed in a controlled fire to prevent the loop from spreading to other modern digital recording systems. The mystery of the 1972 surveyor remains an unsolved file in the dusty cabinets of the local sheriff office. Experts say that the footage was likely a double exposure caused by the age of the magnetic tape and the heat. Silas knew the difference between a technical error and a man trying to find his way back to the main road. He lived the rest of his life in a house with no mirrors and no windows that faced the north side. The memory of the red pixels remained as a factual record of a night when the past became the present. The blizzard eventually ends, but the patterns we leave behind in the static never truly fade away from the world. In this new story, a forgotten winter incident recorded in an old county archive still raises questions about a lake house found half frozen during a historic storm. Investigators who later revisited the file admitted that several details continued to unsettle them despite careful reviews and steady cross-checks. Ryland Keats was 36 and worked as a custom woodworker who often stayed near remote lakes to sketch designs when his schedule finally slowed. He planned a quiet weekend away from clients and rented a small lake house managed by an older couple who lived several miles down the shoreline. The couple noted that Ryland seemed calm and said he hoped to enjoy a frozen lakeside walk before snow deepened across the region later that night. He arrived at the house before dusk and placed his sketch bag near a window overlooking the lake, which reflected sheets of early forming ice. Weather alerts shifted rapidly that evening when meteorologists warned of air pressure collapse across the county, which could generate dangerous gusts. Ryland attempted a brief walk along the frozen shoreline, but turned back quickly after hearing loud cracks traveling beneath the surface of the ice. He contacted the property owners by radio to say he would stay inside until daylight because the temperature had dropped faster than expected. The owners logged the call and mentioned that previous storms once caused strange echo patterns across the lake due to the ice reacting to pressure. The incident began when the owners attempted a routine check later that night and received only faint static along with short metallic pulses. A ranger named Mallory Sabin was on patrol nearby and overheard clipped transmissions that sounded like someone speaking under severe interference. She tried raising Ryland twice, but his signal dissolved quickly, so she drove her snow-capable truck toward the lake house despite worsening visibility. She later reported that gusts pushed ice fragments across the road and forced her to stop several times as shifting snow erased tire tracks ahead. Mallory reached the house after dark and noticed an unusual blue glow flickering through the frosted window, which resembled a lantern struggling. She knocked and called Ryland's name because property records confirmed he was the only guest staying at the lake house that weekend. There was no response, so she tried the door, which opened without resistance, even though the hinges were nearly frozen from the rising storm. Inside, she saw Ryland's jacket on a chair and his sketchbook open on the table, displaying a half-drawn shoreline image that stopped abruptly. The lantern on the counter flickered strangely while Mallory inspected the room and attempted to understand the heavy quiet that filled the house. She called for Ryland again and moved carefully across the floor because thin frost had formed on the boards near the back door earlier that evening. A mug of cooling coffee sat beside a scattered pencil set, and a single boot lay near the hallway, which suggested hurried movement. Deputies later observed that the back door showed a narrow ice seam along its edge, which indicated it had been opened briefly during freezing gusts. 2 deputies arrived and began searching the lakeside in slow expanding arcs, though their lights struggled to cut through drifting powder. They found footprints near the back porch that led toward the frozen lake, but the trail vanished where the wind had swept the surface clean. Deputies noted the prints were uneven, as if Ryland had changed direction suddenly or slipped where ice formed ridges under the fresh snow. They attempted to follow the faint path, but retreated when loud groans echoed across the lake, suggesting unstable ice beneath their weight. Inside the house, investigators documented scattered belongings, which indicated Rylan had started packing before stepping outside unexpectedly. His phone rested near the lantern with a cracked screen and displayed a half-written message that ended mid-sentence during interference. The message referenced a deep thud outside, which he believed came from shifting lake ice reacting to sudden changes in temperature. But investigators discovered no crater or collapse in the ice near the house, which forced them to question whether the sound had originated elsewhere. Environmental sensors around the lake recorded a brief pressure dip during the same time Rylan drafted the message, though the cause was unclear. Experts explained that lakes sometimes emit strong acoustic shocks when rapid temperature changes cause layers of ice to buckle under tension. However, a house inspection revealed a warped floorboard near the back entry, which did not match typical swelling caused by cold exposure. Deputies examining the interior walls found frost patterns shaped in long vertical lines, which suggested a sudden airflow surge inside the house. At sunrise, search teams returned to the frozen lake, where visibility allowed them to identify old guide stakes placed along a historic walking route. One stake near a small inlet leaned at an unnatural angle, and beneath it they found a torn scrap from the lining of Rylan's missing glove. The scrap was lightly frozen to the ice, which implied it had been exposed only briefly before overnight snowfall covered the lake. This discovery directed teams toward a series of narrow cracks that extended from the inlet into deeper sections of the frozen water. A volunteer team followed the cracks carefully and located a shallow indentation where someone had slid or fallen based on surface scratches. They also found a small hand radio half buried in frost near a break in the ice, which matched the registration number assigned to the lake house. The radio showed deep scratches and a bent antenna, which indicated hard impact likely caused during a fall rather than intentional use. Divers later searched beneath the break, but limited visibility and shifting ice prevented a thorough inspection of deeper sections of the lake. Investigators theorized that Rylan stepped outside after hearing the deep thud he referenced and attempted to determine whether the ice was shifting. They believed he approached the lake's edge during a temporary lull and misjudged distance because whiteout bands obscured the shoreline. He likely slipped along an ice ridge and slid toward the inlet, where the surface cracked under his weight during the most intense winds. Teams expanded their search radius for another day, but new fractures formed across the lake, forcing them to halt operations for safety. Weeks later, audio technicians revisited Rylan's final radio attempts and isolated a strange harmonic resonance behind his voice. The tone resembled a layered echo that did not match typical interference caused by weather patterns over frozen lakes. One analyst suggested the sound might have come from stressed ice plates striking each other in rapid succession, though he admitted the timing felt off. Another believed the resonance resembled an underwater pressure fluctuation, though no equipment existed at the lake to confirm such activity. Investigators continued reviewing notes from the house, including frost lines, warped boards, and unexplained temperature fluctuations. Some experts proposed that a rapid pressure burst through the inlet could have forced cold air into the house, creating vertical frost streaks. Others argued that the warped floorboard suggested localized vibration strong enough to disrupt the house structure briefly during the storm. None of the theories fit perfectly with sensor records, which remained inconsistent during peak storm period due to equipment failures. Later interviews with previous winter visitors revealed that strange acoustic booms occasionally echoed across the lake during sudden freezes. Several described moments when ice plates shifted and sent sharp pressure waves toward the shoreline, though none mentioned structural effects. One visitor recalled the lantern inside the lake house flickering violently during a past storm, which matched what Mallory observed on arrival. These accounts supported the idea of unique lake conditions, but still failed to explain the floor distortion found during the investigation. A geological survey conducted months later identified several deep fissures beneath the frozen lake caused by long-term structural changes underwater. Surveyors suggested that rare pressure events might occur when unstable ice layers collapsed under shifting weight during extreme cold snaps. They believed such pressure bursts could generate the sounds Rylan heard, though they emphasized that events strong enough to deform a building were unusual. This theory aligned with some evidence, but still left major questions unanswered, especially regarding the warped floor and sudden airflow patterns. Despite extensive efforts, investigators agreed that Rylan most likely slipped into the frozen inlet after approaching the lake during unstable conditions. Whiteout gusts combined with shifting ice would have created disorientation and masked dangerous sections where cracks formed beneath accumulating snow. However, the unusual frost patterns inside the house and the warped floorboard continued to unsettle specialists who studied the case years later. These anomalies appeared in the final report, which labeled the precise trigger for Rylan's exit as unresolved due to conflicting evidence. Seasonal crews installed warning signs along the inlet, urging winter visitors to avoid the frozen lake during rapid temperature shifts. The lake house owners updated their safety guidelines, advising guests to stay indoors during sharp pressure changes detected by regional sensors. Training programs across the county referenced the case to demonstrate the sudden hazards associated with frozen lakes during severe storms. Yet the puzzle of Rylan's final moments remained open for debate among investigators who believed key atmospheric details were still missing. Experts who revisit the file today agree that the case endures not because of impossible theories, but because of small, unexplained contradictions. The harmonic audio resonance, the warped floorboard, and the frost lines inside the lake house each resist simple interpretation. Most investigators conclude that Rylan likely suffered an accidental fall while attempting to understand the deep thud he heard outside that evening. The case endures in local memory as a haunting reminder that frozen lakes can hide unpredictable forces capable of overwhelming even careful visitors. Why investigators stopped searching this forest trail? Search and rescue logs from the summer of 1994 contain several redacted entries regarding a popular hiking trail. These official documents mention a series of unexplained events that forced local authorities to permanently close the entire wooded area to the public. Silas Thorne was a 48-year-old forest ranger who spent his career patrolling the rugged northern ridgelines in the park. He was a practical man who understood the dangers of the wilderness and respected the unpredictable nature of the high mountains. Silas lived in a small cabin near the park entrance and kept a detailed journal of every unusual sighting he encountered. One humid morning in August, he received a report about a group of hikers who had vanished near the valley stream. The trail was a well-marked path that thousands of people used every single year without any major safety concerns. He packed his medical kit and checked his topographical maps to plan a search route through the dense green forest. Silas drove his government truck to the trailhead and noticed that the morning birds were unusually quiet in the heavy air. He reported his position to the station and mentioned that a thick fog was starting to settle over the lower valley. A strange metallic humming sound coming from the trees made him pause as he adjusted his heavy nylon backpack straps. He looked toward the thick brush, but the sound was not coming from any mechanical equipment or known service vehicles. Silas continued down the dirt path and noticed that the trail markers had been moved from their original wooden posts. He saw a bright orange ribbon tied to a branch that led deep into a section of the woods labeled off-limits. The ranger decided to follow the ribbon to see if the missing hikers had wandered into the dangerous rocky terrain. The forest became incredibly dark as the trees grew closer together, and the sun was blocked by the thick canopy. He looked at his compass and realized the needle was spinning in rapid circles without pointing toward the North Pole. Silas stopped walking and noticed that his heavy boots were leaving deep indentations in the soil that glowed with purple light. The glowing soil started to vibrate as a low-frequency pulse echoed through the floor of the quiet, dark forest. Silas checked his emergency radio for a signal, but the device only produced a series of rhythmic and high clicks. He knew that the local geology was not capable of producing magnetic interference of this specific and intense magnitude. The clicks on the radio stopped, and a voice began to whisper a set of names that sounded familiar to him. Silas grabbed his official logbook and realized the names belonged to people who had gone missing in 1972. He looked at the trees and saw that the bark had been carved with hundreds of small and intricate geometric patterns. The ranger followed the carvings until he reached a clearing where the trees had been pushed by an incredible force. He saw a white tent standing in the center of the clearing that appeared to be brand new and very clean. The tent was unoccupied, but the interior was filled with rows of glass jars that contained different types of soil. Silas stepped inside the tent and saw a small table with a silver tray holding a collection of silver rings. Each ring had a date engraved on the inside that matched the years of the most famous local missing cases. Silas realized that these items were not left behind by hikers, but were being displayed as a specific collection. He found a handheld recorder on the table that was actively capturing the sounds of the forest outside the white tent. Silas pressed the playback button and heard a recording of his own truck arriving at the trailhead recently. The recording included the sound of him speaking into his radio about the thick fog and the quiet birds today. He felt a sharp pain in his chest as a bright flash of light filled the small and white tent. Silas ran out of the tent and scrambled back toward the main trail as the ground began to shake. He reached his truck and drove toward the ranger station without stopping to check for the missing hikers again. Silas told his supervisor about the glowing soil and the silver rings and the strange recordings in the woods. The supervisor looked at the maps and told Silas that the clearing he described did not exist on any survey. A team of 20 investigators returned to the forest trail the following morning to search for any signs of the tent. They found the orange ribbon and the spinning compasses, but the clearing was nothing but a wall of trees. There was no glowing soil and no white tent and no collection of silver rings in the area. The lead investigator looked at Silas and asked if he had been experiencing any symptoms of heat stroke. Silas pulled a single silver ring from his pocket to prove that he had actually been inside the tent. He opened his hand, but the ring had turned into a piece of brittle wood that crumbled into dust. The authorities decided to stop the search and permanently closed the forest trail to protect the public from events. Silas resigned from the Forest Service and moved to a coastal town where there were no trees at all. He kept his original journal, but the pages describing that day were now completely blank and smelled like ozone. He realized that the things he saw in the forest were part of a cycle that repeated often. Silas never went hiking again because he knew that some trails lead to places that do not exist. The forest trail remains closed to this day and is heavily patrolled by private security teams in uniforms. Construction crews tried to pave over the area in 2012, but their heavy machinery failed every time. No records of the missing hikers were ever found in the state archives, and their families stopped asking questions. Silas Thorne lived the rest of his life in silence and never spoke about the glowing purple soil again. Some mysteries are buried so deep in the woods that they are better left for the trees to guard. The truth about why they stopped searching remains hidden under the thick canopy and the silence of the ridge. Silas often wondered if the recordings he heard were being played for someone else who had entered the woods. He knew the forest had its own way of reclaiming the things that people tried to document and report. The strange frequency that he heard on the radio was never detected by any other official equipment in the park. The trail is now overgrown with thorns and heavy brush that makes it nearly impossible for anyone to pass. Local legends say that the birds still go silent whenever the fog begins to roll in from the north. Silas left his journal to the local historical society, but the specific entries about the white tent were gone. Investigators eventually stopped visiting the site after several members of the security team reported hearing voices in the static. The state government removed the trail from all modern maps to ensure that no curious travelers would get lost. The case of the vanishing hikers from 1994 was officially listed as an unsolved wilderness accident. Silas Thorne died knowing that the collection in the white tent was likely still growing with every passing cycle. The woods remain a place where the rules of the world do not always apply to those who enter. His footprints from that day were reported to have faded within minutes of his escape from the clearing. Internal reports suggested that radiation levels in the closed area stayed above normal for several years following the event. Witnesses from nearby towns occasionally report seeing pulsing lights appearing behind the trees when the moon is high. No new investigation has been launched due to fear of what might be rediscovered in the dark of the woods. Silas often sat on the pier of his coastal home, staring at the ocean and wondering about the others. He knew that human memory is a fragile thing that can be easily changed by forces we do not understand. The brown dust from the wooden ring remained in a small jar on his mantle as a silent reminder. Events at the Northern Forest Trail will never be fully reported to avoid mass panic in the general region. Local residents still talk about the disappearances when they gather at the old coffee shop on the edge of town. They know that parts of the mountain do not want to be disturbed by human presence or technology. The secret of 1994 is locked behind the chain-link fence that now surrounds the forest area. Silas Thorne took the secret of the radio whispers to his grave without ever sharing them with anyone. The trees will continue to grow and cover all physical evidence until nothing is left but a fading legend. Whenever the wind blows hard from the north, people remember the last warning written by the forest ranger. Do not follow the orange ribbons that do not lead you back home because the woods have their collection. This story ends as a reminder that the wilderness still holds dark corners that we will never truly master. The purple light Silas saw beneath his feet was perhaps a sign of something older than human history itself. The area is now a dead zone for all modern communication signals, and no satellite can take clear images. The forest has swallowed the past and the future into a single entity that cannot be pierced by logic. Silas Thorne went in peace, but his eyes always turned toward the north as if he were waiting. The mystery of the forest trail will remain part of the darkest secrets of the earth among the trees. The truth the investigators sought was ultimately just a reflection of their own fear of the deep unknown. The popular hiking trail is now just a name in an old document that is yellowing and fading. The silence there is a type of silence that speaks of things that are better left unheard or unseen. New rangers are now given strict instructions to avoid the perimeter fence without asking any medical or operational questions. The path that was once full of families and laughter is now reclaimed by a darkness that refuses to leave. Silas knew that the collection of rings was just a small part of a much larger and darker truth. The world is much stranger than the maps lead us to believe when we walk under the ancient trees. The missing tape, found inside an abandoned ranger station. In the late summer of 1984, a local hiking group discovered a small cabin hidden deep within the woods. The structure served as an old ranger station that the forestry department had officially decommissioned over 30 years before that day. Inside the dusty main room, they found a single magnetic tape sitting on a desk next to an empty lantern. The reel was thick with grime and appeared to have been untouched since the mid-20th century was still in its prime. Silas Vance was a 32-year-old land surveyor who spent most of his weeks mapping the rugged terrain. He arrived at the trailhead early on a Tuesday morning with the simple goal of marking the western boundary lines. The weather was unusually clear for that time of year, and Silas expected to finish his work before the sunset. He carried a heavy pack filled with surveying tools and a large thermos of coffee to keep his energy levels high. The forest was quiet, and the air felt heavy with the scent of damp pine needles and ancient decaying wood. As Silas pushed through a dense thicket of pine trees, he stumbled upon the rotted remains of a wooden fence. He followed the timber line until he saw the silhouette of a small building perched on a rocky limestone ledge. The windows were boarded up with gray planks, and the front door hung slightly open on its rusted iron hinges. Silas stepped onto the porch and felt the floorboards groan under his weight as he moved toward the dark interior. He noticed that the structural integrity of the cabin was failing as the roof sagged under the weight of moss. He pushed the door open and noticed a strange scent of old paper and copper hanging heavy in the air. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, but the desk in the center of the room looked surprisingly clean. Silas approached the desk and saw a reel-to-reel tape recorder sitting ready as if someone just stepped away. He found a small black cassette tape resting beside the machine with a handwritten label that simply said August 4th. The handwriting was cramped and looked as though it had been written by a hand that was shaking with fear. According to local archives, the last ranger assigned to this specific station was a man named Elias Thorne in 1950. Dispatch logs from that year indicate that Elias stopped responding to his weekly radio check-ins without any prior warning. Search teams combed the surrounding hills for several weeks but never found a trace of the missing Forest Service employee. Silas picked up the tape and realized it was the only piece of modern equipment left in the entire building. He felt a cold sensation in his chest as he wondered what had truly happened to the man named Elias. The surveyor decided to bring the tape back to his office to see if the recorded audio contained any clues. He spent the next 3 hours hiking back to his truck while the sun began to dip below the horizon. Silas felt a strange sense of urgency to hear the voice of the man who had vanished so long ago. He drove home in silence and immediately began searching for a compatible player to listen to the old magnetic reel. The town was quiet as he passed through the main street and noticed the flickering lights of the old theater. Silas eventually found a working player at a local thrift store and connected it to his desk speakers that evening. He pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of static, followed by the sound of a heavy door closing. A voice that sounded tired and strained began to speak about a series of lights appearing in the northern valley. The man on the recording claimed that the lights were moving in patterns that did not match any known aircraft. He spoke with a level of detail that suggested he was an experienced observer of the natural mountain world. The narrator described how the lights would hover over the tree line for hours before disappearing into the deep mountain lakes. Witness statements from 1950 mentioned similar sightings by residents in the nearby town of Oakhaven during that same summer. Elias Thorne reported that he had started hearing a low humming sound coming from the floorboards of the station. He believed that something was living beneath the cabin and was using the radio antenna to broadcast a strange signal. The humming was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass jars on the shelves to vibrate and crack. Silas listened closely as the recording captured the sound of rhythmic tapping against the exterior walls of the ranger station. Elias stopped speaking for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the heavy breathing of a man. The ranger whispered that he could see eyes reflecting the moonlight through the gaps in the wooden boards of the door. He claimed that the visitors were not from the town, and they did not look like any animals he knew. The tapping was persistent and moved from the walls up to the shingles on the roof with great speed. The investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne had originally concluded that he likely suffered from isolation and wandered off. However, the details on the tape suggested that the ranger was documenting a very specific and physical threat to his safety. Silas paused the audio and looked at the date on the tape, which was the day before Elias went missing. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the tapping on the recording was getting much louder. The sound was sharp and sounded like metal striking against the ancient wood of the isolated mountain station. The final few minutes of the audio contained a frantic description of the cabin being surrounded by a bright blue light. Elias shouted that the humming sound was vibrating the glass in the windows and making his ears bleed from the pressure. He mentioned that he was going to hide the tape in the desk and hoped that someone would eventually find it. The recording ended abruptly with a loud metallic crash and the sound of the wind rushing through the open station. Silence filled the room of Silas as the tape continued to spin without any more recorded sound or voices. Silas contacted the local historical society the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the abandoned woods. A researcher named Marcus Reed examined the tape and confirmed that the voice matched the old radio logs of Elias Thorne. They returned to the site of the ranger station together to look for the hidden compartment Elias mentioned on the tape. The forest seemed different under the morning light, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their minds. They found a small metal box buried under the floorboards that contained a series of photographs and a silver ring. The photographs showed blurry images of metallic objects hovering over the very trees Silas had walked through just the day before. One image captured a tall figure standing in the shadows of the porch with elongated limbs and very large dark eyes. Marcus noted that the silver ring had strange symbols etched into the band that did not belong to any language. They realized that Elias Thorne had not simply disappeared, but had been documenting an encounter that defies any logical explanation. The symbols on the ring seemed to glow faintly when the men brought it into the direct sunlight. The authorities reopened the case, but the physical evidence remained the only proof of what happened on that August night. Silas often thinks about the quiet ranger station and the man who spent his final hours recording a warning for others. The tape serves as a haunting reminder that some mysteries are buried in the woods for a very good reason. He no longer surveys that section of the forest because the low humming sound still echoes in his quiet dreams. The station remains empty and forgotten by most, but the tape still holds the secrets of 1950. Every time Silas looks at the jagged peaks of the mountains, he remembers the frantic voice of the lost forest ranger. He kept a copy of the tape in a safe place, but he rarely has the courage to play the audio. The researcher Marcus Reed moved away shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the silver ring again. Local legends continue to grow about the station on the limestone ledge and the lights that still appear in the valley. Silas knows that the truth is recorded on that thin magnetic strip hidden inside the drawer of his wooden desk. This final voicemail from a highway turnout still has no explanation. The discovery of a mobile phone at the edge of a steep embankment changed the direction of a major search. A local road worker found the device while clearing dry brush near a remote highway turnout in the late autumn season. The battery was long dead, but the internal storage remained intact and contained a single recording that baffled the local authorities. It was a 3-minute voicemail left on an answering machine that seemed to document a very strange and sudden disappearance. Lyle Vance was a 42-year-old long-haul trucker who had spent his career driving through the high desert. He arrived at the mountain pass early on a Tuesday night with the simple goal of resting before his final delivery. The weather was unusually clear for that time of year, and Lyle expected to finish his route well before the sunrise. He carried a heavy thermos of coffee and a small notebook to record his mileage and fuel stops for the company. The highway was quiet, and the air felt heavy with the scent of sagebrush and cold engine oil that night. As Lyle pulled his heavy silver truck into the paved turnout, he noticed a series of strange lights in the sky. He followed the flickering glow with his eyes until he reached the very edge of the gravel shoulder near the cliff. The dash cam recorded him parking the vehicle and stepping out to inspect a noise coming from the rear of the trailer. Lyle looked toward the horizon and seemed to be tracking something moving quickly through the rocks near the base of peaks. He returned to the cab and checked his radio before realizing that the signal was dropping out for no clear reason. He sat in the driver's seat, and the internal microphone captured a strange humming sound that seemed to come from above. A thick layer of dust began to swirl around the hood of the car, even though there was no wind there. Lyle reached for his phone to call his wife and leave a quick message about the delay in his scheduled return. The voicemail began with him explaining that he saw a group of figures walking across the empty highway in the dark. His voice was shaky and suggested that Lyle was feeling a sudden sense of physical disorientation or a deep growing fear. According to local archives, the area where Lyle stopped had been the site of several unexplained events since 1974. Dispatch logs from that year indicate that multiple drivers reported seeing shadows that moved without making any sound on the road. Search teams arrived at the turnout 4 days after Lyle was reported missing, but they found no signs of struggle. They found his truck idling with the door wide open, but the keys were missing from the heavy metal ignition switch. Lyle left his phone on the dashboard, and it was the only piece of hardware that had a recorded file. The trucker had decided to keep the call active even when he realized that no one was picking up the phone. He spent the last few minutes of his recorded life staring into the darkness while the microphone picked up a rhythmic. Lyle felt a strange sense of curiosity and stepped out of the truck one last time to investigate the bright glow. He walked toward the edge of the turnout and disappeared from the range of the cab lights as the clicking grew. The town was quiet when the investigators finally played the footage back at the local police station several long weeks later. The authorities eventually found a working player and watched the final 30 minutes of the video file with the volume up. They pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of electronic interference, followed by the sound of a latch. A voice that sounded distant and distorted began to overlap with the audio of the wind blowing through the mountain pass. The figure on the screen moved with a fluid motion that did not match the walk of any human being. He spoke with a level of urgency that suggested he was trying to warn his wife about a sudden light. The footage described how a large shadow would move across the pavement even when the moon was hidden behind the clouds. Witness statements from 2022 mention similar shadows being seen by a group of tourists in the same mountain sector. Lyle Vance reported that he had started feeling a heavy pressure in his chest as the clicking sound moved closer. He believed that something was projecting a frequency that was intended to keep him from starting his truck and leaving now. The pressure was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass of the side mirrors to develop a network of cracks. The investigators listened closely as the recording captured the sound of heavy scratching against the aluminum panels of the trailer. Lyle stopped moving for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the rapid clicking of a mechanism. The trucker whispered that he could see a tall shape standing just beyond the reach of the high-beam lights. He claimed that the visitors were waiting for the fuel to run out so the turnout would be in darkness. The scratching was persistent and moved from the tires up to the roof of the cab with great mechanical precision. The investigation into the disappearance of Lyle Vance had originally concluded that he likely suffered a medical event and fell. However, the details on the phone suggested that the trucker was being actively followed by something that understood his equipment. The sheriff paused the video and looked at the timestamp, which showed that the camera stopped at exactly 3 in the morning. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the clicking on the recording matched the heartbeat of man. The sound was sharp and sounded like metal striking against the frame of the heavy truck in the quiet night. The final few seconds of the voicemail contained a frantic glimpse of a hand reaching toward the window from outside. Lyle shouted that the light in the sky was getting larger and was drawing the oxygen out of the air. He mentioned that he was going to try and hide the phone so that someone would eventually find the record. The recording ended abruptly with a bright flash of white light and the sound of the truck horn being triggered. Silence filled the room of the station as the screen turned black without any more images of the mountain pass. The sheriff contacted the state police the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the internal storage. A technician named Silas Reed examined the digital files and confirmed that the audio had not been tampered with or edited. They returned to the site of the turnout together to look for the notebook Lyle mentioned in his final words. The desert seemed empty under the afternoon sun, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their tired minds. They found a small metal box buried in the gravel that contained a series of sketches and a ring. The sketches showed detailed drawings of a craft that looked like a polished stone floating just above the jagged highway. One image captured a figure standing in the middle of the road with glowing patterns etched into its gray skin. Silas noted that the silver ring had a residue on it that glowed when exposed to an ultraviolet light source. They realized that Lyle Vance had not simply wandered off, but had been documenting a presence that has been there. The patterns on the sketches seemed to shift when the men looked at them from a different angle in the light. The authorities closed the case officially, but the phone remains in a high-security evidence locker at the county office. The family of Lyle Vance often thinks about the quiet trucker and the warning he tried to leave for them. The video serves as a haunting reminder that the desert holds secrets that are better left undisturbed by those who drive. He no longer explores the high desert because the clicking sound still echoes in the back of his mind at night. The turnout remains empty and avoided by locals, but the phone still holds the final warning of 2020. Every time Silas drives past the mountain pass, he remembers the frantic voice of the lost trucker on that old phone. He kept a copy of the report in a safe place, but he rarely has the courage to read it. The technician, Silas Reed, moved away shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the silver ring again. Local legends continue to grow about the highway pull-off and the lights that still appear over the mountain peaks. Lyle knew that the truth was recorded on that small device hidden at the edge of the steep drop. Today, the highway is monitored by new cameras that do not require a man to sit in a cab in dark. The turnout is paved with fresh asphalt, and the state has removed the old signs from the high mountain sector. Silas Vance spends his time working in the valley where the lights of the city keep the shadows away. He still wonders if the clicking sound he heard on the phone was a message or just the sound of time. The mountain wind continues to blow dust against the truck stop while the memory of the driver fades into history. Some things are not meant to be recorded by a man who is just trying to get home to his family. Lyle Vance left his voice behind to tell a story that the desert tried to bury in the rocks long ago. The phone remains the only witness to a night that ended with a flash of light and a cold room. He is gone, but the recording continues to play for those who are brave enough to listen to the truth. The high desert is a place of long shadows and deep silence that can swallow a man and truck. We may never know what Lyle saw through the glass of the truck, but we have his voice to guide us. The warning is there for anyone who finds themselves alone in the dark near the old mountain highway in the sand. He was just a driver doing his job when the world changed and the lights came down from the sky. The routine ended, but the story of the recording will live as long as the memory of the turnout. The truth is still out there, waiting for the next person to pull over and look into the dark trees. The silence of the high desert is never truly empty when you listen to the static on the old radio bands. Silas Reed still looks at the stars and wonders if Lyle is out there looking back at the bright city. The silver ring sits in a velvet box and refuses to lose its strange and cold glow in the night. The investigation is over, but the mystery of the highway turnout will never be solved by the men on Earth. It is a story that belongs to the wind and the stars and the man who left his phone behind. We are all just travelers on a road that leads into the unknown parts of the vast and empty world. Lyle Vance was the first to find the secret, and he will not be the last to see the light. The highway remains open, but the turnout is a place where the shadows move with a life of their own. Listen to the wind when you drive through the mountains, and you might hear the clicking sound of the desert. It is the sound of a secret that has been kept for a very long time by the old rocks. The story of Lyle Vance is a reminder that we are never truly alone, even in the most remote places. The final voicemail is a bridge between our world and the one that exists just beyond the reach of lights. We should be careful where we choose to rest when the sun goes down and the desert starts to speak. The light is beautiful, but it carries a price that some men are not prepared to pay in the end. Lyle paid that price, and his voice is all that remains of his long journey through the dark mountain pass. The road goes on forever, but some drivers never reach the end of the line because of the lights. Keep your eyes on the road and do not look too long into the shadows of the high desert. The truth is there, but it is hidden in the static and the clicking of the old magnetic tapes. Silas Vance knows this, and that is why he stays in the city where the lights never go out. The mountain is waiting for the next truck to pull over and listen to the humming in the air. Be safe on the highway and remember the name of the man who tried to warn us all that night. The story of the missing trucker is a tale that will be told as long as people drive. There is no explanation for the voicemail, but there is a lesson in the silence that follows the loud click. We are just small parts of a much larger mystery that is unfolding every night in the dark woods. The highway turnout is a doorway, and Lyle Vance was the one who walked through it into the unknown. We have the recording, and that is enough to know that the desert is alive with a strange power. The mystery remains, and the world continues to turn while the stars watch over the empty and quiet road. Silas closes his eyes and hears the voice of his friend calling out from the distance of the stars. The end of the story is just the beginning of a much larger journey for those who are taken. We will wait for the next sign and hope that we are ready for the light when it comes. The highway is long, and the night is deep, and the secrets are many in the high mountain pass. Be careful where you stop, because you might not be the only one looking for a place to rest. The voicemail is the only thing that is left of a man who saw too much. It is a warning that we should all heed when we find ourselves alone on the road. The truth is out there, and it is waiting for the next recording to begin in dark. Silas Reed knows the truth, and he will never return to the highway turnout in the desert. The story is finished, but the mystery will live on in the hearts of those who listen. Lyle Vance is gone, but his voice will never be forgotten by the people who find the phone. The desert has spoken, and the recording is the final word on the matter of the lights. An archived voicemail investigators still study. The silent servers of the regional telecommunications hub in the coastal city of Blackwood Bay remained a quiet witness to the digital age. A single automated backup drive sat perched atop a weathered metal rack inside the remote boundary of a busy industrial park. This specific device was programmed to record all redirected emergency voicemails every 60 seconds to monitor service reliability and potential network failures. Local communications officials rarely checked the digital archives unless a significant outage or a major system crash was reported in the area. On a Tuesday, in October of 2022, the recorder captured a sequence of audio data that seemed entirely ordinary. Silas Thorne was a 44-year-old senior systems technician who worked for the regional utility department during that busy year. His primary job involved traveling to remote locations to ensure that backup power units and data transmitters were functioning within normal parameters. Silas enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the rugged landscape far from the crowded city noise. He was a man of meticulous detail who could spot a signal interference pattern in 1,000 lines of raw code. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific server unit was experiencing a strange recurring storage error. He packed his tools into his white utility truck and began the long drive toward the isolated signal tower near the coast. The drive took nearly 3 hours, and the fog hung low over the dense canopy of ancient cedar and fir trees. Silas reached the base of the tower and connected his rugged laptop to the diagnostic port located inside the metal box. He noticed that the hard drive was almost full of temporary files that should have been deleted automatically every 30 days. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of voice recordings taken during a recent heavy rainstorm. Silas decided to download the final batch of audio files before he cleared the memory and reset the internal software of the server. He wanted to make sure the digital sensor had not been damaged by the high humidity or the coastal salt air. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the audio waves to ensure the recordings were still properly indexed. He saw the familiar blue lines and the blurred shapes of passing data packets that moved through the system at high speeds. One recording from 3 nights prior caught his ear because the background static sounded different from the audio files around it. A single voicemail was placed from a narrow shoulder of the highway just past the edge of the rocky cliffs. The caller had their voice low, and the message was left standing wide open toward the dark and crashing ocean waves. It was an odd place to call because that specific section of the road was known for having absolutely no cellular service. Silas felt a slight chill because the caller reportedly sounded calm despite the absolute silence of the surrounding environment during the midnight hours. He clicked on the next file in the sequence to see if the person was speaking to a dispatcher for emergency help. The audio log was still there, but the verbal report was now silenced and a dark hum stood near the end. The signal appeared to be reaching into the dense brush, and it was pulling something heavy out from the digital shadows. Silas zoomed in on the grainy audio until he could see the silhouette of a large and repeating electronic pulse. The data on his screen was describing a rhythmic movement that matched the pace of a slow and steady physical breath. He checked the timestamps and realized that the call had been at that specific location for less than 5 minutes total. The third recording showed the signal strength pulling back to 0 and leaving nothing but tire tracks in the audio file. Silas looked toward the actual spot on the map and saw that the ground was entirely undeveloped near the pine trees. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished. He stepped into his truck and drove toward the exact place where the signal had pointed in the archived radio log. The air was cold, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the high branches of the trees. The ground was soft from the recent rains, and he noticed deep gouges in the earth where something heavy had been dragged. He followed the trail for about 50 feet until he reached a small clearing hidden behind a thicket of overgrown ferns. Silas found a heavy metal storage trunk tucked under a pile of damp pine needles and branches that looked intentionally placed. He reached down to touch the cold plastic surface and saw that the heavy latches were sealed with industrial duct tape. A faint smell of metallic decay hung in the stagnant air, and Silas immediately pulled his hand back in sudden realization. He knew that he should not open the container without the proper law enforcement authorities present at the remote scene. He used his mobile radio to contact the dispatch office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious item in the woods. Within an hour, 2 state troopers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with yellow plastic tape. They asked Silas to show them the audio logs on his laptop so they could identify the tone and the pitch. The officers noted that the caller did not have a registered phone number in any of the captured maritime records. They carefully cut the tape on the trunk and discovered several stolen historical artifacts from a local museum storage facility. These were items that had been missing for months following a quiet break-in that left no physical evidence behind. The museum had reported a quiet break-in 3 months earlier, but the investigators had no leads on the missing items. These artifacts were extremely valuable, and the thieves had likely hidden them in the forest until the search died down. The police realized the caller must have returned to the woods to move the cache to a more permanent location. They analyzed the signal logs from other towers along the coast to track the path of the unknown vehicle. This lead eventually took them to a small rental property located 2 towns over from the edge of the park. They found the suspect living in a detached garage behind a row of tall hedges and old weeds. Inside the house, the authorities found more items that had been taken during the same period earlier that same year. The suspect had been living there under a false name while he waited for a buyer to finalize a secret purchase. One of the men was a former security guard who knew exactly how to avoid the primary surveillance monitoring systems. He did not realize that the remote signal tower was set to record every frequency, regardless of any active transmission. His simple mistake of making a call in that specific spot had provided the only evidence needed to solve the case. The archives of the utility department had captured the one moment he thought was completely private in the dark. Silas returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details. Most people would have deleted the corrupted files without listening to the audio because it was a routine maintenance job. The historical records were now safe from the looters, and the original artifacts were returned to their rightful display cases. He continued his work across the mountains and always looked a little closer at the logs from the lonely signal towers. Sometimes the most important things are hidden in the background noise of a world that is always moving too fast. The quiet technician had become an accidental hero by simply doing his job with a very watchful ear. The automated recorder still sits in its metal box and records the passage of time, one file at a time. It captures the wind and the trees and the occasional signal that travels through the silence of the deep woods. No one ever suspects that a simple machine could be the most important witness to a crime in the wilderness. Silas knows that every audio log tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to listen. He drives the coast with a new perspective and watches the signal meters for anything else the antenna might catch. The forest remains vast and mysterious, but it is no longer a place where secrets can stay hidden forever. The federal investigation revealed that the suspects had intended to sell the items on the black market to private collectors. This operation would have stripped the town of its legal history and compromised the integrity of the local museum archives. The recovery of the original artifacts ensured that several ongoing historical research projects could be settled with accurate evidence. Silas received a formal commendation from the regional board for his role in preserving the heritage of the entire coastal community. He often shares the story of the archived voicemail with new technicians as a lesson in professional diligence and care. The signal logs are now fully digitized, but the physical history remains protected by the sensors and the heavy forest. The quiet tower stands on the hill and continues to serve the residents as it has for many years. Visitors drive past the industrial park without knowing the secret that was hidden deep beneath the canopy of the trees. The story of the digital recorder and the metal trunk has become a local legend among the city residents. Most people walk past the signal tower without realizing its significance in the history of the regional maritime safety. For Silas, the sound of the wind against the antenna will always be a reminder of the hidden truths. The record of the world continues to grow one frame at a time. For anyone who cares to look, the truth about what happened on that Tuesday in October remains locked away in boxes of redacted paperwork and files. The people of Blackwood Bay continue their lives while the mystery of the archived voicemail hangs over the coast. It is a reminder that some things are captured by the machines that are never meant to be understood by humans. Silas continues to keep his watch from a distance, knowing that the sensors will eventually trigger another silent alarm. The silence of the forest is never truly empty when the sensors are the only ones left to listen. The story of the call is written in the data and preserved in the digital logs. In this new story, archived Winter Patrol summaries describe a remote ski lodge where several visitors reportedly vanished during January storms across multiple decades. Officials never confirmed foul play, which left the lodge classified as a low-priority site despite the strange overlap in dates. Old regional bulletins noted that each disappearance occurred within days of the first heavy snowfall, which created a pattern difficult to ignore. Ronan Kessler, a 36-year-old field technician, received a routine task on a freezing morning when his supervisor asked him to inspect abandoned power lines near that ridge. The request surprised him because the site had not appeared on maintenance schedules for years. He prepared his truck with insulated gear, his weather-worn notebook, and a sturdy radio known to survive interference. The early sky looked pale and washed out, which usually signaled an incoming storm building behind the mountains. He drove up the single-lane access road, which climbed steadily until trees vanished behind blankets of white. Drifts covered the route, which forced him to stop several times to clear ice near the wheel wells. When he reached the last turn, he saw the lodge looming through shifting snow. The structure looked crooked from years of neglect, yet fresh footprints led directly to the warped front door. That detail unsettled him because archives mentioned no active crews assigned to the lodge during winter. Ronan stepped out while the wind whipped icy flakes across the ridge. He approached the entrance slowly since the wooden deck creaked under his boots. A rusted metal sign hung sideways above the door while strands of caution tape fluttered against a railing. The smell of cold pine mixed with a faint chemical scent that reminded him of old industrial labs. He hesitated before pushing open the door, which groaned loudly under layers of ice. Inside, he found a lobby coated in dust and frost. Faded ski posters sagged from the walls, and a collapsed rental counter leaned at an awkward angle. The chemical odor strengthened, which made him breathe shallowly through his scarf. He stood still to listen for movement because abandoned structures often held unexpected hazards. The silence felt oppressive and heavy, like the lodge was absorbing sounds rather than echoing them. A sudden metallic clash rang from a far corridor, which made him tighten his grip on the flashlight. Snow blew through a cracked window, adding a restless whisper to the emptiness. He said quietly, "Hello," while hoping to flush out any squatters. No answer came, which increased his concern. He walked toward the noise with careful steps, because uneven floors hid under piles of broken plaster. Halfway down the corridor, he found a steel grate leaning against the wall. Its weight and finish did not match the lodge design, which suggested someone installed it recently. Behind it, he saw a narrow maintenance stairwell missing from old blueprints. He documented the discovery with several photos, then stepped back because the chemical smell grew overwhelming near the stairwell opening. Steam-like condensation rose upward, which felt too warm for an abandoned building in deep winter. Ronan returned to the main corridor and entered a storage room where the door hung crooked on a single hinge. A tripod stood in the center of the room with a camera aimed at a roughly cut hole in the wall. Dust covered everything except the lens, which shone clean in his flashlight beam. The battery compartment sat empty, which suggested deliberate removal. He wrote a quick note in his book about the setup because the arrangement looked designed rather than accidental. A heavy thump sounded from the upper floor, which shook loose frost from exposed rafters. Ronan flinched, then steadied himself before climbing the staircase. The wooden steps bowed under his weight, which forced him to test each board before moving forward. On the landing, he discovered rooms stripped nearly to their frames. One room held several winter jackets arranged neatly along a wall. The jackets looked too new for the lodge and showed no signs of mold, which indicated they had not been here long. He checked a tag that matched a model released only a few years earlier. Near a toppled dresser, he found an emergency service patch tucked between floorboards. The fabric looked clean, which meant someone had dropped it recently. He placed it inside an evidence envelope because the detail felt too important to ignore. Outside the window, he saw the storm intensify until the sky turned white. Snowfall thickened to the point that distant tree lines disappeared. Ronan followed smaller footprints leading toward the lounge where skylight glass had collapsed into hardened ice. The prints cut through drifts before stopping at a kitchen door. He opened it and found a metal table dragged across the floor, leaving long scrape marks. Beneath the table, a wooden hatch stood open, which revealed a stairwell carved into darkness. The chemical smell rushed outward with surprising force, which made him recoil. A faint cough drifted up from the stairwell, which made him freeze. He whispered, "I hear you," and waited. A weak voice answered with a strained plea for help. He descended cautiously because unstable structures could collapse unexpectedly. At the bottom, he found a basement lined with insulation sheets arranged almost like padding. Several portable heaters stood unplugged yet positioned in a deliberate pattern. A pulley system hung overhead with ropes stretched tightly across beams. Behind a crate, he found a woman in her early 20s slumped against the wall with frostbitten fingers and a torn parka. Her voice trembled as she tried to explain what happened. She and a friend entered the lodge 2 days earlier when they were caught in a sudden storm. They heard machinery deeper inside and approached it, believing it might lead to shelter. She remembered stepping on a section of floor that dropped suddenly, which sent her falling into the basement while her friend tried to pull her up. She lost consciousness shortly afterward. Ronan checked her pulse, which felt weak yet steady. He guided her to sit upright against a crate, then searched for signs of the missing friend. Near the pulley system, he found boot impressions similar to the prints upstairs. Scratch marks lined a wooden frame that hid a recessed pressure plate. Someone had tried to pry open the frame using a flat tool. He moved the frame aside with effort, which revealed the plate covered in dust except for a single clean fingerprint. When he pressed the plate lightly, a loud click came from the ceiling, which sounded like a mechanical trigger resetting. He realized the lodge had been altered with a system of hidden traps that responded to pressure changes and weight distribution. The craftsmanship required knowledge beyond casual tinkering. Someone built these modifications intentionally and likely over several winters. A sudden crack from above signaled the hatch beginning to close under its own power. Ronan grabbed the woman and hurried up the stairs as the door slammed shut behind them. The echo vibrated through the corridor, which reminded him of controlled mechanisms, not typical decay. They entered the kitchen where the room groaned under storm pressure. The wind roared through broken vents, which matched the earlier warm draft rising from the stairwell. In the lobby, he noticed the steel grate along the hallway beginning to slide across the floor. The movement looked unnatural because no visible motor powered it. He rushed forward while supporting the woman and jammed a fallen ski pole under the grate, which slowed its closing. They slipped past into the snow as the grate clanged shut behind them with finality. Outside, the storm battered them with bursts of icy wind. Ronan wrapped her in a heavy blanket and secured her in the truck before starting the engine. The wheels spun until they caught traction along the icy path. The descent took hours, while visibility dropped to almost nothing. The constant drum of sleet against the windshield nearly drowned out the woman's occasional murmurs. They reached a ranger station before midnight, where medics treated her for exposure. She offered fragmented details about clicking noises and shifting floors. Investigators interviewed her over several days, though her memory blurred around the moment the floor collapsed. She insisted she heard breathing near the walls during the hours before she fell. When authorities reached the lodge several days later, they found much of the mechanical system dismantled. The pulley framework remained, though the ropes were cut and several gears removed. Inspectors noted inconsistent footprints around the stairwell, suggesting someone visited after Ronan escaped. The jackets in the upper room had vanished, and the tripod camera was gone, along with the clean lens. Ronan accompanied a second team to verify details in his original report. The lodge interior looked different from his earlier visit, which unsettled him. Several rooms had collapsed ceilings that were intact days before. Marks on the floor that once indicated mechanical movement now appeared faint or replaced with scattered debris. Only the pressure plate remained unchanged, though it now sat covered with a fine layer of frost. Later analysis of regional utility files uncovered an unregistered service request from a contractor using a false company name. The request dated back many winters and mentioned delivery of specialized metal components to a site matching the lodge's coordinates. Investigators never traced the contractor despite repeated attempts. During a follow-up search, rangers found an old sled buried under several feet of snow behind the building. The sled carried fragments of rope identical to fibers in the basement pulley system. They also discovered a rusted metal frame with adjustable weights similar to early counterbalance prototypes used in training facilities many decades earlier. Ronan provided additional notes describing temperature shifts he felt inside the lodge, which suggested hidden vents still operated despite no visible power source. Technicians checked for backup generators but found none. They concluded that stored mechanical energy might have powered some of the systems, though no clear explanation emerged. The missing hiker eventually recovered enough to share more details. They remembered hearing rhythmic knocking sounds shortly before becoming separated. They believed the sound came from within the walls, though investigators could not confirm it. The hiker recalled climbing through a tight service gap before blacking out on the ridge, which explained their location when found. Local residents discussed the incident throughout the season. Some believed the lodge served as a clandestine workshop for an unknown engineer fascinated with pressure-triggered traps. Others suspected the place was used as a winter hideout by someone who did not want company. A few claimed older generations whispered about strange noises near that ridge long before the lodge existed. Ronan avoided the site after his final visit because every clue pointed toward deliberate manipulation rather than random decay. The combination of warm drafts, shifting floors, and automated grates suggested a creator who still visited during heavy storms. He often replayed the moment the grate moved by itself, which convinced him the system remained active even after partial dismantling. Authorities secured the area with new barriers and updated warnings. The lodge still stands, buried under January snow. Windows rattle during storms, which gives the building a faint pulse, like a living thing adjusting to winter pressure. Those who approach claim the lodge feels watchful. The basement stairwell remains the most disturbing feature because even sealed doors cannot hide the subtle warmth drifting upward long after all mechanisms supposedly stopped. Ronan believes someone mastered the rhythm of storms and used the lodge to test ideas during the quietest nights. The deeper truth remains locked within those walls, where sound, machinery, and winter silence blend into something quietly waiting for the next January visitor who wanders too close to a place that never fully lets go of its secrets. Why this bridge is monitored every winter. The massive suspension bridge spanning the narrow canyon of the Iron River remained a silent witness to the brutal winters of the Northern Range for over 60 years. A single automated structural sensor sat perched atop a weathered steel girder near the remote boundary of the central support tower. This specific device was programmed to take a high-resolution photograph every 60 seconds to monitor the dangerous buildup of ice and snow on the suspension cables. Local maintenance officials rarely checked the digital archives unless a significant tremor or a major blizzard was reported in the area. On a Tuesday in December of 2022, the camera recorded a sequence of images that seemed entirely ordinary to any casual observer. Caleb Vance was a 42-year-old structural technician who worked for the Regional Bridge Authority during that busy year. His primary job involved traveling to remote locations to ensure that solar panels and data transmitters were functioning within normal parameters. Caleb enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the rugged landscape far from the city noise. He was a man of meticulous detail who could spot a hairline fracture in 1,000 square feet of reinforced steel. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific camera unit was experiencing a strange recurring storage error. He packed his tools into his white utility truck and began the long drive toward the isolated canyon crossing. The drive took nearly 3 hours, and the fog hung low over the dense canopy of ancient cedar and fir trees. Caleb reached the base of the tower and connected his rugged laptop to the diagnostic port located inside the metal box. He noticed that the hard drive was almost full of temporary files that should have been deleted automatically every month. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of photographs taken during a recent heavy ice storm. Caleb decided to download the final batch of images before he cleared the memory and reset the internal software of the camera. He wanted to make sure the optical sensor had not been damaged by the freezing rain or the high winds. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the thumbnails to ensure the lens was still properly focused. He saw the familiar gray cables and the blurred shapes of passing cars that moved through the frame at high speeds. One image from 3 nights prior caught his eye because the background lighting looked different from the photos around it. A dark maintenance van was parked on the narrow shoulder of the bridge just past the edge of the pedestrian walkway. The van had its hazard lights on, and the rear cargo door was left standing wide open toward the deep canyon below. It was an odd place to stop because the bridge was cleared of all work crews during the winter months. Caleb felt a slight chill because that section of the river crossing was known for having absolutely no cellular phone service coverage. He clicked on the next photo in the sequence to see if a worker was standing near the vehicle for help. The dark van was still there, but the open door was now closed and a dark figure stood near the edge. The figure appeared to be reaching over the metal railing, and they were pulling something heavy out from the deep shadows. Caleb zoomed in on the grainy pixels until he could see the silhouette of a large and dusty industrial trunk. The person in the photo was wearing a heavy insulated parka that obscured their identity from the camera lens. He checked the timestamps and realized that the person had been at that specific location for less than 5 minutes total. The third photo showed the dark van pulling back onto the asphalt and leaving nothing but tire tracks in the slush. Caleb looked toward the actual spot on the shoulder and saw that the snow was still flattened near the railing. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished. He stepped over the safety barrier and walked toward the exact place where the figure had stood in the photograph. The air was freezing, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the massive steel cables. The ground was slick from the recent ice, and he noticed deep grooves in the frost where something heavy had been dragged. He followed the trail for about 20 feet until he reached a small maintenance access hatch hidden behind a thicket of support beams. Caleb found the industrial trunk tucked under a pile of damp tarpaulins and heavy coils of wire that looked intentionally placed. He reached down to touch the cold metal surface and saw that the heavy latches were sealed with industrial duct tape. A faint smell of metallic decay hung in the stagnant air, and Caleb immediately pulled his hand back in sudden realization. He knew that he should not open the container without the proper law enforcement authorities present at the scene. He used his satellite radio to contact the dispatch office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious item on the bridge. Within an hour, 2 state troopers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with yellow plastic tape. They asked Caleb to show them the photographs on his laptop so they could identify the make and the model of the van. The officers noted that the vehicle did not have a visible rear license plate in any of the captured frames. They carefully cut the tape on the trunk and discovered several stolen historical artifacts from a local museum storage facility. These were items that had been missing for months following a quiet break-in that left no physical evidence. The museum had reported a quiet break-in 3 months earlier, but the investigators had no leads on the missing items. These artifacts were extremely valuable, and the thieves had likely hidden them on the bridge until the search died down. The police realized the driver must have returned to the crossing to move the cache to a more permanent location. They analyzed the bridge camera data from other units along the highway to track the path of the dark van. This lead eventually took them to a small rental property located 2 towns over from the edge of the canyon. They found the vehicle hidden in a detached garage behind a row of tall hedges and old weeds. Inside the house, the authorities found more items that had been taken during the same heist earlier that same year. The suspects had been living there under false names while they waited for a buyer to finalize a secret overseas purchase. One of the men was a former bridge inspector who knew exactly how to avoid the primary security monitoring systems. He did not realize that the remote structural camera was set to trigger every minute, regardless of any motion detection. His simple mistake of parking in that specific spot had provided the only evidence needed to solve the entire case. The archives of the Bridge Authority had captured the one moment he thought was completely private. Caleb returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details. Most people would have deleted the corrupted files without looking at the images because it was a routine maintenance job. The Iron River Bridge was now safe from the looters, and the historical treasures were returned to their rightful display cases. He continued his work across the mountains and always looked a little closer at the photos from the lonely spans. Sometimes the most important things are hidden in the background of a world that is always moving too fast. The quiet technician had become an accidental hero by simply doing his job with a very watchful eye. The automated camera still stands on its steel girder and records the passage of time one frame at a time. It captures the fog and the ice and the occasional car that travels through the silence of the deep canyon. No one ever suspects that a simple machine could be the most important witness to a crime in the wilderness. Caleb knows that every photograph tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to look for it. He drives the highway with a new perspective and watches the shadows for anything else the lens might have caught. The bridge remains vast and mysterious, but it is no longer a place where secrets can stay hidden forever. The federal investigation into the museum theft revealed that the suspects had intended to smuggle the artifacts across the border. This operation would have stripped the region of its cultural history and compromised the integrity of the local museum archives. The recovery of the original artifacts ensured that several ongoing historical research projects could be settled with accurate evidence. Caleb received a formal commendation from the state governor for his role in preserving the heritage of the entire mountain community. He often shares the story of the bridge camera with new technicians as a lesson in professional diligence. The structural logs are now fully digitized, but the physical history remains protected by the sensors and the heavy steel beams. The quiet bridge stands over the river and continues to serve the travelers as it has for many decades. Visitors admire the architecture and the views of the canyon without knowing the secret that was hidden deep beneath the walkway. The story of the structural sensor and the industrial trunk has become a local legend among the mountain residents. Most people walk past the steel tower without realizing its significance in the history of the regional highway. For Caleb, the sound of the wind against the cables will always be a reminder of the hidden truths in the cold. The record of the world continues to grow one frame at a time for anyone who cares to look. The truth about what happened on that Tuesday in December remains locked away in boxes of redacted paperwork and police files. The people of the mountain valley continue their lives while the mystery of the bridge camera hangs over the canyon. It is a reminder that some things are captured by the machines that are never meant to be understood by humans. Caleb continues to keep his watch from a distance, knowing that the sensors will eventually trigger another silent alarm. The silence of the bridge is never truly empty when the sensors are the only ones left to listen. The story of the Iron River is written in the steel and preserved in the digital logs. The Bridge Authority implemented new security protocols to review all storage errors manually to prevent similar incidents from going unnoticed. Caleb is often cited in training sessions as the primary example of a technician who performed his duty with excellence. The highway continues to wind through the pines, and the camera continues to click in the silence of the night. Every minute, a new frame is added to the digital history of the Northern Corridor for the safety of all travelers. The record of the world grows steadily as the machines watch over the lonely places where humans rarely venture alone. Caleb knows that the truth is always there, waiting to be found by someone with the patience to look. The mystery of the canyon bridge is solved, but the watch over the mountain highway will never truly come to an end. The silence of the pines is now filled with the knowledge that the past is finally safe and secure. Technicians now take a little more time to review the archives before they clear out the temporary storage on site. They look for the parked vans and the open doors and the figures moving through the shadows in the dark. The mountains keep many secrets, but they are becoming harder to hide from the ever-watchful digital eyes of the sensors. Caleb takes a final look at his laptop screen before he packs up his gear and heads back to the city. Everything is as it should be, and the system is functioning perfectly once again for the next 30 days of winter. He starts his truck and begins the long descent toward the valley while the mountain peaks fade in the mirror. The bridge is a lonely path through the wilderness, but it is no longer a place of hidden crimes and secrets. Every minute, a small click echoes from the top of the steel tower as a new image is captured. The record of the world continues to grow one frame at a time for anyone who cares to look. The story of the bridge is over, but the watch over the canyon will never truly end. This 911 call from January was never meant to air. The release of a redacted audio file from a county emergency database revealed a series of events that the local sheriff department had originally classified as a closed case. A public records advocate discovered the recording while searching for unrelated traffic logs from the early weeks of the winter season last year. The audio was remarkably clear and captured the final moments of a lone driver who had stopped at an isolated mountain rest area. It contained a sequence of frantic reports that suggested something was stalking the caller from the frozen shadows of the pine forest. Harlan Vance was a 50-year-old industrial mechanic who spent his weeks driving to various remote manufacturing plant sites for urgent repairs. He arrived at the gravel turnout near the state forest boundary early on a Thursday night to check a strange sound in his engine. The weather was unusually calm for that time of year, and Harlan expected to finish his inspection before the midnight snow began to fall. He carried a heavy-duty wrench and a high-powered flashlight to examine the undercarriage of his large silver transport truck. The highway was silent, and the air felt heavy with the scent of pine needles and cold mountain air during that night. As Harlan walked around the rear of his trailer, he noticed a series of strange markings etched into the frozen asphalt near his tires. He followed the trail of dark residue with his light until he reached the edge of the dense and silent tree line. The internal logs of the dispatch center recorded him placing a call at exactly 11:45 in the evening of January 12th. Harlan reported that he saw a group of tall figures standing perfectly still just beyond the reach of his high beams. He returned to the cab and locked the doors before realizing that his radio was emitting a very loud and steady hum. He sat in the driver's seat, and the audio recording captured a strange clicking sound that seemed to be growing in volume. A thick layer of white frost began to form on the interior windshield, even though the desert air was quite warm before. Harlan reached for his handset to tell the operator that the figures were now moving toward the front of the heavy truck. The dispatcher reportedly heard him explaining that the figures did not have any visible faces or any discernible human features at all. His voice was shaky and suggested that Harlan was feeling a sudden sense of physical disorientation and intense primal fear. According to local archives, the area where Harlan parked had been the site of several unexplained events since 1961. Dispatch logs from that decade indicate that multiple drivers reported seeing lights that moved in strange patterns over the high ridges. Search teams arrived at the gravel turnout 3 days after Harlan was reported missing, but they found no signs of struggle. They found his truck with the engine still running and the headlights on, but the driver was completely gone from the cab. Harlan left his flashlight on the ground, and it was the only piece of gear that showed signs of extreme heat. The mechanic had decided to keep the line open, even when the dispatcher told him to stay inside the vehicle and wait. He spent the last few minutes of his recorded life describing a bright blue glow that was filling the entire forest. Harlan felt a strange sense of curiosity and stepped out of the truck one last time to see the source of light. He walked toward the trees and disappeared from the range of the cab lights as the clicking sound grew much louder. The town was quiet when the investigators finally played the call back at the county station several long months later. The authorities eventually found a working monitor and watched the final 30 minutes of the dashcam file with the volume up. They pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of electronic interference followed by the sound of a heavy latch. A voice that sounded distant and distorted began to overlap with the audio of the wind blowing through the mountain pass. The figure on the screen moved with a fluid motion that did not match the gait of any normal human hiker. He spoke with a level of urgency that suggested he was trying to warn someone about a light approaching the truck. The footage described how a large shadow would move across the ground even when the moon was hidden by the clouds. Witness statements from 2023 mentioned similar shadows being seen by a group of geologists working in that specific sector. Harlan Vance reported that he had started feeling a heavy pressure in his chest as the clicking moved much closer. He believed that something was projecting a frequency that was intended to keep him from leaving the turnout that Tuesday night. The pressure was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass of the windshield to develop a network of cracks. The investigators listened closely as the recording captured the sound of heavy scratching against the side of the silver truck. Harlan stopped moving for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the rapid clicking of a strange mechanism. The mechanic whispered that he could see a tall shape standing just beyond the reach of the high-beam lights. He claimed that the visitors were waiting for the battery to die so the turnout would be in total darkness. The scratching was persistent and moved from the tires up to the roof of the vehicle with incredible precision. The investigation into the disappearance of Harlan Vance had originally concluded that he likely fell into a deep and hidden canyon. However, the details on the dispatch recording suggested that the mechanic was being actively hunted by something very strange and old. The sheriff paused the audio and looked at the timestamp, which showed that the call ended at exactly 3 in the morning. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the clicking on the recording matched a human heartbeat perfectly. The sound was sharp and sounded like bones striking against the metal frame of the heavy silver transport truck. The final few seconds of the call contained a frantic glimpse of a hand reaching toward the truck window from outside. Harlan shouted that the light in the sky was getting larger and was drawing the oxygen out of the cold air. He mentioned that he was going to try and run toward the old ranger station he saw earlier that day. The recording ended abruptly with a bright flash of white light and the sound of the line going dead forever. Silence filled the room of the station as the audio stopped without any more words from the lost mechanic. The sheriff contacted the Forest Service the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the archived call file. A technician named Marcus Reed examined the digital files and confirmed that the audio had not been tampered with or edited. They returned to the site of the turnout together to look for the ranger station Harlan mentioned in his words. The woods seemed empty under the afternoon sun, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their tired minds. They found a small metal box buried in the dirt that contained a series of sketches and a ring. The sketches showed detailed drawings of a craft that looked like a polished stone floating just above the forest floor. One image captured a figure standing in the doorway of a cave with glowing patterns etched into its gray skin. Marcus noted that the silver ring had a residue on it that glowed when exposed to an ultraviolet light source. They realized that Harlan Vance had not simply wandered off, but had been documenting a presence that was very ancient. The patterns on the sketches seemed to shift when the men looked at them from a different angle today. The authorities closed the case officially, but the dispatch recording remains in a high-security evidence locker at the office. The family of Harlan Vance often thinks about the quiet mechanic and the warning he tried to leave behind then. The audio serves as a haunting reminder that the forest holds secrets that are better left undisturbed by the living world. He no longer explores the high desert because the clicking sound still echoes in the back of his mind tonight. The turnout remains empty and avoided by locals, but the recording still holds the final warning of the night. Every time Marcus drives past that specific mile marker on the highway, he remembers the frantic voice on the tape. He kept a photocopy of the report in a secure file, but he rarely has the courage to read it. The researcher, Marcus Reed, resigned from his position shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the ring. Local legends continue to grow about the unmarked turnout and the blue lights that still appear in the deep woods. Silas knows that the truth is buried deep in the limestone, where the vibrations never truly stopped moving there. The county records indicate that several other calls were placed from the same area during the following weeks of January. Each caller described a similar sensation of being watched by something that could not be seen in the direct light. One woman reported that her car engine died at the same spot and she heard the clicking sound for hours. She managed to restart her vehicle and flee, but she refuses to drive that stretch of road after the sunset. The patterns in the calls suggest that the phenomenon is tied to the lunar cycle and the forest density. The sheriff has since ordered a permanent closure of the gravel turnout to prevent any more travelers from stopping there. There are no signs explaining the decision, but the heavy concrete barriers send a clear message to stay away now. Marcus Reed believes that the signals recorded on the 911 call were not meant for human ears to understand today. He suggests that the clicking was a form of data transmission between the figures and the craft in the sky. The silver ring remains the only physical link to a world that exists just beyond our own perception. The story of the call that was never meant to air has become a cautionary tale for the local dispatchers. They are taught to recognize the specific signs of electronic interference and the sound of the rhythmic clicking in the background. If a caller reports a blue light in the forest, the operators are instructed to tell them to drive fast. The mountains keep their secrets well, but occasionally a recording escapes the archives to tell us the truth about the plan. We are all just travelers on a road that is far more mysterious than we can ever truly imagine. Harlan Vance is a name that will be remembered by those who have heard the frantic urgency in his final. His voice serves as a bridge between the mundane world and the unknown that waits in the shadows of January. We listen to the static on the old radio bands, and we wonder if he is still calling out. The light is beautiful, but it carries a price that most people are not willing to pay in the "be careful where you choose to stop when the sun goes down and the forest starts to speak tonight." The mystery of the mountain pass is a burden that the sheriff carries with him every single day he works. He knows that the 911 call was just one small part of a much larger story involving the lights. The archived audio will remain in the dark until someone else is brave enough to listen to the final clicks. We are not alone in the wilderness, and the recordings prove that some things are better left in silence. Stay on the road and keep your eyes moving, because the shadows are always watching the travelers in the Tointine. This abandoned cabin drew quiet warnings. The dense forests of the northern border states are filled with small structures that have been reclaimed by the thick moss over time. Local history records from the early 1970s indicate that one specific property on the ridge was deliberately left off all official maps. Silas Vance was 58 years old and worked as a senior land surveyor for a private timber company in the valley. He had spent 30 years walking through the brush, but he always avoided the steep slope near the jagged limestone cliffs. Silas arrived at the base of the ridge during a rainy morning in October with a goal to mark the timberline. The air was heavy with the scent of damp pine needles and the distant sound of the rushing mountain river below. He pushed through a thick stand of cedar trees and found the cabin standing in a small and unnervingly quiet clearing. The first strange detail was that the cabin appeared to be built from timber that did not grow in this specific region. Silas saw that the logs were a dark and heavy species of wood that usually only exists in much higher altitudes. He checked his handheld GPS unit and found that the signal was bouncing wildly between different coordinates in a fast pattern. Silas moved toward the front door and noticed that the wood had been carved with hundreds of small and precise notches. The local sheriff had once told Silas that the old cabin was a place where people went when they wanted to vanish. This warning had seemed like a simple campfire story until Silas saw the heavy iron locks on the outside of the door. Silas assumed the locks were meant to keep animals out, but they were positioned to keep something from pushing the door open. An hour later, Silas found a rusted metal box buried under a pile of rotted firewood near the back porch steps. This box contained a stack of black and white photographs and a small diary wrapped in a piece of red fabric. The photos were dated from 1964 to 1972, and they showed the cabin at different times of day. Silas flipped through the images and realized that the forest around the cabin never changed or grew in the 8 years shown. It looked like the trees were frozen in a specific stage of autumn despite the passage of nearly a decade of seasons. Silas checked the names written on the back of the photos, but they were all listed as missing in the county. It was impossible to tell why these people had gathered at this cabin, or what they were waiting for in the woods. The surveyor began to feel a sense of heavy observation as he stood in the center of the silent forest clearing. He decided to open the diary to see if it contained any explanation for the strange notches on the exterior logs. Silas read the entries and found that the writer was a man who claimed the cabin was not always physically there. The man wrote that the structure would appear during the heavy fog and then vanish when the sun hit the high ridge. Silas felt a chill despite his heavy wool coat because the handwriting looked exactly like the notes from the old dispatcher files. His mentor had mentioned a surveyor named Elias who disappeared on this ridge during a storm in 1972. Elias had been tasked with marking the same timberline that Silas was currently standing on during this rainy autumn. A third anomaly appeared when Silas looked through the dusty window and saw a table set for a very large meal. The plates were filled with food that looked fresh and steaming, even though the cabin had been abandoned for many years. Silas placed his hand on the glass and found that the window was vibrating with a low and steady electrical hum. One specific chair at the head of the table was pulled out as if someone had just stood up to leave. This chair faced a wall that was covered in a massive map of the stars that were not currently visible. Silas asked himself why a simple woodsman would need such a complex understanding of the movement of the celestial bodies. When Silas looked back at the forest, he saw a man in a red jacket standing near the cedar trees. Silas started connecting the dates in the diary with the records of the great blizzard that hit the valley years ago. He used a red pen to mark the nights when the local residents had reported seeing strange lights on the ridge. The lights occurred on the exact same nights that the missing persons had last been seen by their family and friends. This pattern suggested that the cabin was acting as a beacon or a doorway for something that moved in the dark. Silas felt the ground shake under his heavy boots, even though there were no active fault lines in this mountain range. He realized the cabin was not a shelter, but was a fixed point for a signal that was being broadcast. Silas reached out to a retired park ranger who had patrolled this sector back in the late 1960s. The ranger listened to the description of the red fabric, and he told Silas to leave the ridge immediately without looking back. The old man whispered that the cabin was built on a pocket of air that did not belong to this world. He claimed that the notches on the logs were a countdown that had been running for over 50 years of time. Silas looked back at the diary and realized the numbers were counting down to the exact date of the current afternoon. Every name listed in the county archives was actually a witness who had seen the cabin appearing through the thick gray fog. Silas found a page that described a man who would come to finish the survey and take the final measurements. The surveyor Elias was the last person to sign the diary before the entries stopped in the winter of '72. According to the final note, Elias had discovered that the cabin was the source of the magnetic interference in the area. Silas realized the man in the red jacket was not a ghost, but was a projection of the lost surveyor himself. He received one final shock when he looked at his own compass and saw the needle spinning in a perfect circle. The figure in the red jacket began to walk toward the cabin door with a steady and very mechanical rhythm. Silas turned away and ran back toward the river as the fog began to swallow the entire ridge in white. He realized that the ordinary cabin was a trap for anyone who tried to map the secrets of the mountain. Silas packed his gear and decided to report that the ridge was too unstable for any timber harvesting or commercial activity. He called his supervisor to say that the coordinates were blocked by limestone deposits that interfered with the radio signal. The supervisor accepted the report without any further questions, as if he were relieved to finally close the folder forever. Silas drove away and watched the mountain peak disappear in the clouds as the first heavy rain began to fall. He kept the red fabric in his pocket as a reminder of the man who was still marking the lines. He never spoke about the cabin to the other surveyors or to the people who lived in the valley. The property was officially designated as a protected wilderness area, but the logs remained there in the deep and quiet. The mystery of the abandoned cabin remains a secret known only to those who have felt the vibration in the ground. Experts say that the mountain air can cause a person to lose their sense of direction and see strange things. Silas knew the difference between a natural fog and a structure that existed between the ticks of a mechanical clock. He lived the rest of his life watching the weather reports for any mention of the ridge and the fog. The forest holds its secrets in the deep roots, and the wind covers the sound of the tapping on wood. The quiet warnings were real, and the cabin is still waiting for the next person to find the path. Silas Vance died, knowing that some lines on a map are not meant to be crossed by any living man. The timber company eventually sold the rights to the land to a private conservation group that promised to keep it wild. They had seen the reports filed by Silas and decided that some areas were better left untouched by modern development. The cabin remains hidden by the fast-growing brush and the thick blankets of snow that fall every single winter. Hikers occasionally report a faint hum coming from the ridge, but they are usually warned to stay on the main trails. The local historical society keeps a small file on the surveyor Elias, but it is restricted to high-level researchers. Silas had left a map behind that showed exactly where the cabin was, but he had crossed it out. He knew that documenting the location was a danger to anyone who might feel tempted to solve the mystery. The air on the ridge stays colder than the surrounding forest, even during the peak of the summer heat in July. Animals avoid the clearing, and birds do not build nests in the branches of the cedar trees that surround the cabin. The surveyor rod that Silas found was never officially turned in to the authorities because he feared what they would do. He buried it in his own backyard under a foot of concrete where it could no longer send out a signal. The red jacket continues to be seen by those who are lost in the woods during the heavy autumn rains. They say the man helps them find their way back to the river before the fog takes the cabin away. It is a cycle that has no beginning and no end in the long history of the mountains. The records of the missing persons were never updated because no remains were ever found on the ridge or nearby. The families eventually moved away, but they always left a light on in case their loved ones finally came home. Silas had realized that the cabin was a place of waiting where time did not function like a straight line. He understood that the people in the photos were still sitting at that table in a different version of today. The stars on the wall map were a guide for a journey that was not meant to be taken on foot. The notches on the logs will eventually reach zero, and the cabin will become a permanent part of the ridge. Silas Vance died at the age of 84 with a smile on his face and a compass in his hand. The woods are deep and full of things that we were never meant to understand with our limited human logic. The warnings were quiet because the truth was too loud for the residents of the small valley to hear clearly. Every time a surveyor goes out to mark a new line, they feel the eyes of the mountain on them. They know that the past is always just a few steps behind them in the thick fog of the forest. The story of Silas and Elias is told in whispers during the long nights of the northern winter storms. It is a reminder that the world is much larger and stranger than any map could ever hope to show. The abandoned cabin stands in silence while the wind carries the sound of a surveyor marking the wooden logs.